Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping quietly into one of the most unsettling chapters in American true crime, a story that unfolded behind closed doors in an ordinary Milwaukee apartment, and stayed hidden far longer than anyone imagined. Jeffrey Dahmer. To the outside world, he looked almost painfully normal, a quiet young man who kept to himself, held simple jobs, and rarely drew attention. He lived in small apartments, shopped at corner stores, and blended into the slow rhythm of the neighborhood around him. Nothing about him stood out. And that was part of the reason no one saw what was unfolding in the shadows. But long before apartment 213 became a place of nightmares, Dahmer was a child wrestling with loneliness, confusion, and urges he didn't understand. His life drifted between isolation and impulse, between wanting connection and pushing it away, until those early fractures began shaping the man he would become. Every step, the silence at home, the broken family, the growing need for control, built toward the darkness that Milwaukee would one day discover. Tonight, we're going to walk through his story quietly and carefully, from his childhood to his first crimes, from missed warning signs to the investigation that shocked the country. Before we begin, drop a comment below and tell me which country you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always incredible seeing this late-night true crime family stretch across different time zones. So settle in. Let the noise of the day fade. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. There's a new story waiting for you every night. Chapter 1, A Troubled Beginning. Childhood Shadows. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer entered the world on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a quiet, unremarkable birth that gave no hint of the weight his name would one day carry. His early years were shaped by a kind of silence that settled over the household, a silence made from exhaustion, emotional distance, and two parents who struggled to manage their own inner storms. His father, Lionel, was a hard-working chemistry student with a practical mind, someone who believed problems could be solved with effort and structure, yet often felt overwhelmed by the pressures of school and family. His mother, Joyce, battled anxiety and depression, slipping into periods of withdrawal and emotional instability that made the home feel tense even during peaceful moments. For young Jeffrey, this instability created a sense of drifting. He learned early that emotions were unpredictable, that comfort was unreliable, and that the safest place to retreat was into himself. By the time he reached kindergarten, neighbors and teachers noted how quiet he was, how he often played alone, how he didn't quite connect with other children the way most kids his age did. It wasn't that he was disruptive or difficult, rather, he was detached, moving through childhood like a boy watching life happen from a distance. When Jeffrey was 4, the Dahmer family moved from Milwaukee to Doylestown, Ohio, a shift that gave them a fresh start but did little to solve the emotional gaps within the home. Lionel spent long stretches buried in schoolwork and lab research, while Joyce, isolated from her own family, struggled with worsening anxiety that sometimes left her bedridden or overwhelmed. These dynamics shaped Jeffrey's world more than anyone realized at the time. The house could be quiet for hours, then suddenly tense, full of arguments, misunderstandings, and sharp words exchanged through worn-out voices. In that environment, Jeffrey learned not to seek comfort, not to rely on warmth, and instead developed a habit of retreating inward. He wandered the yard, explored the nearby woods, and spent long stretches of time observing the natural world around him, birds, insects, and small animals that fascinated him in a way his parents didn't fully understand. While his father tried to engage him by explaining scientific concepts or offering encouragement, the emotional distance between them made their relationship feel more like two worlds orbiting each other without truly meeting. As Jeffrey grew older, his sense of isolation deepened. He struggled socially, often hovering at the edge of groups, saying little, and avoiding eye contact. His classmates found him odd but harmless. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, his voice was soft, his words carefully chosen. Teachers described him as polite yet distant, intelligent yet unengaged. He did not show behavioral problems, but he also didn't show the curiosity or enthusiasm that most children his age displayed. Instead, he moved through his days like someone observing life rather than participating in it. Meanwhile, his home life continued to fracture. Joyce's mental health fluctuated dramatically. Some days she was energetic and affectionate, other days she shut herself away, overwhelmed by panic and emotional strain. Lionel tried to keep the family functioning, but the disconnect between husband and wife grew wider with each passing year, leaving Jeffrey caught in the middle of a household where affection felt rare and tension felt constant. For a child already prone to withdrawal, these conditions created fertile ground for loneliness to take deep root. As he entered elementary school, Jeffrey began developing an unusual interest in the remains of small animals he found near the woods and roadsides. He was curious in a quiet, observational way, examining bones, studying the shapes, and trying to understand how the pieces fit together. While this curiosity began innocently, it often happened without adult guidance, leaving him alone with thoughts and interests he didn't know how to articulate. When Lionel discovered Jeffrey's fascination with bones, he assumed it was a scientific curiosity, something harmless that a father could encourage. He even showed Jeffrey how to preserve bones safely using household chemicals, thinking it might nurture an interest in biology. But neither parent saw the deeper emotional void their son was trying to fill, how he used these solitary activities as a way to create a sense of control, predictability, and focus in a world where he otherwise felt invisible. By the time Jeffrey reached his early teenage years, the fractures in the Dahmer household had become impossible to ignore. Arguments between Lionel and Joyce grew more frequent, often erupting late at night behind half-closed doors. Jeffrey, lying awake in his room, absorbed every word, every slam of a door, every sigh of exhaustion. He internalized the tension without reacting to it, storing it quietly the way he stored every feeling he didn't know how to express. At school, he remained a loner, polite, quiet, but increasingly withdrawn. Teachers saw the signs of a troubled child, but his good behavior and calm demeanor made it easy to overlook the emotional turmoil he carried. He drifted through hallways with lowered eyes, blending into the background, unnoticed and unremarkable. As adolescence approached, Jeffrey's sense of disconnection from others grew sharper. His parents' marriage deteriorated into separation, then arguments about custody, finances, and blame. Jeffrey watched the family unravel, feeling like a visitor in his own home. He began relying on alcohol to numb the discomfort, sneaking drinks before school and hiding bottles in the woods. Classmates noticed he often smelled of liquor, but they brushed it off as strange behavior from a boy they already found odd. Teachers made notes, but no major interventions were made. Jeffrey's internal world became a private landscape of loneliness, confusion, and unspoken frustration, and he had no one to talk to about it, not parents, not friends, not teachers. The isolation grew into a quiet ache that he carried everywhere he went. Even during family gatherings, Jeffrey sat on the edges, speaking only when necessary. Relatives described him as shy, polite, well-behaved, but emotionally distant. No one saw the storm forming beneath the stillness. No one recognized how the combination of emotional neglect, instability, and isolation was shaping a personality that felt fundamentally disconnected from others. In many ways, Jeffrey felt like he moved through life behind a sheet of glass, watching, listening, mimicking normal behavior without feeling truly part of the world around him. He longed for connection but didn't know how to reach for it. He wanted stability but saw only conflict. And as he stepped deeper into adolescence, the lack of emotional guidance left him navigating complicated feelings entirely alone. The signs of trouble were subtle, scattered across the years like quiet warnings no one recognized. His withdrawal from peers. His increasing reliance on alcohol. His fascination with anatomy. His detachment from family conflict. His inability to express emotions. His struggle to understand himself. Each one alone was easy to overlook. Together, they formed a pattern that hinted at a deeper struggle, one that would shape the course of his life far more than anyone around him could have guessed. But in those early years, Jeffrey was simply seen as a quiet boy from a troubled home. A boy who kept to himself. A boy whose sadness was hidden behind stillness. A boy whose future seemed uncertain but not alarming. No one knew that the silence inside him was not empty, it was filling, slowly, quietly, shaping a mind that felt increasingly distant from the world around it. And as Jeffrey moved through adolescence and edged toward adulthood, the foundation laid in those early years would soon lead him down a path no one could have predicted, and no one would forget. Chapter 2, Adolescence and Early Signs, Isolation and Obsession. As Jeffrey Dahmer moved into adolescence, the quiet loneliness that had settled around him during childhood began to harden into something heavier, more permanent, like a shadow stretching behind him no matter where he walked. By the time he reached junior high, the easy friendships other boys formed seemed to elude him completely. He drifted through hallways with a slouched posture and a distant stare, his expression unreadable, his voice rarely heard above a whisper. Teachers described him as polite but disengaged, a boy who completed assignments mechanically, without enthusiasm or curiosity. In group activities, he hovered at the edges. In gym class, he stayed silent. At lunch, he often ate alone, picking at his food while the noise of other students washed over him like static he could not tune out. His isolation was so consistent that classmates started referring to him as the kid who just sat there, present in body but miles away in thought. Even in moments where he tried to join in, something about him, his stiffness, his quietness, the way he avoided eye contact, made it difficult for others to know how to talk to him. At home, the atmosphere was no better. The Dahmer household continued its turbulent spiral, with Joyce's emotional struggles deepening and Lionel's patience thinning under the weight of marital conflict and career obligations. Arguments erupted often, echoing through the house like sudden storms, then fading into cold stretches of silence. Jeffrey, caught in the middle, withdrew further, barricading himself emotionally against the unpredictability around him. His room became a small sanctuary, not of comfort, but of solitude, a place where he could sit for hours, staring into space, lost in thoughts he never shared. The absence of warmth, structure, and emotional support left him adrift, and without guidance, he began slipping into habits that offered a temporary sense of escape. Alcohol became a steady companion. By the time he reached high school, he was drinking before class, smuggling liquor in the lining of his jacket or hiding bottles in the woods behind his house. The alcohol didn't bring happiness, it simply muted the discomfort, dulled the noise in his mind, and softened the sharp edges of daily life. Classmates began to notice, though more in amusement than concern. The quiet boy who rarely spoke started developing a strange pattern of behavior, sudden, exaggerated disruptions meant to startle others, falling out of chairs, imitating seizures, or making odd noises to break tension in class. These antics earned him the nickname, the Dahmer Show, a label taken as a joke by peers who saw his behavior as quirky entertainment rather than a cry for attention or connection. For Jeffrey, these moments were a way to step outside himself, even briefly, to become someone else for a few seconds, someone people noticed. But the laughter he received never translated into real friendship or understanding. The more he tried to fit in, the more he felt out of place. His emotional world remained locked behind walls he could not articulate, and every attempt to reach out seemed to collapse back into silence. During this period, Jeffrey's interest in anatomy, bones, and the internal structure of living beings grew, not from malice but from a kind of scientific curiosity mixed with the need for control and order. Without anyone to guide that curiosity or recognize the deeper implications, it became another solitary activity he kept hidden. He collected animal bones, studied roadkill, and sometimes buried and unearthed remains to observe the decomposition process. To him, These activities offered a strange sense of structure, a world where everything had a pattern, a process, a predictable result. Unlike human emotions, which felt chaotic and confusing, anatomy made sense. Bones fit together. Functions had explanations. Processes followed rules. In a life full of unpredictability, this was something he understood. Yet these behaviors unfolded privately, unnoticed by adults who were too distracted by their own conflicts to see the larger picture forming. As high school progressed, the Dahmer home finally fractured completely. Lionel and Joyce's marriage dissolved in a storm of resentment, miscommunication, and emotional exhaustion. Joyce's struggles intensified until she moved out abruptly, taking Jeffrey's younger brother with her and leaving Jeffrey alone with Lionel, two emotionally disconnected individuals sharing a house that felt more like a waiting room than a home. Eventually, even Lionel left, moving out when the tension became too much, assuming Jeffrey, now a young man nearing adulthood, would be fine on his own for a short period. Instead, Jeffrey was left completely unsupervised, isolated in an empty house with no guidance, no companionship, and no structure. The loneliness that had haunted him since childhood now expanded into every corner of his life, settling heavily inside him like a thick fog. Days blurred together. Nights were filled with drinking, wandering, and thoughts he did not know how to express. At school, his grades continued to slip. He barely passed classes, often arriving intoxicated or drifting through the day in a haze. Teachers expressed concern but lacked the information and training to intervene effectively. Friends, or rather, classmates who occasionally included him in jokes, noticed his drinking but dismissed it as teenage rebellion rather than a sign of deep internal distress. A guidance counselor might have helped. A concerned adult might have asked questions. But no one did. Jeffrey moved closer and closer to the edge of adulthood with no foundation, no support system, and no emotional tools for navigating the challenges ahead. In the midst of this, his inner world grew increasingly complex and unsettled. He struggled with identity, loneliness, and the fear that something was fundamentally wrong within him. But without anyone to talk to, without a language for describing his confusion, the emotions churned silently inside him, forming patterns he didn't understand. He longed for connection, not just social interaction, but a sense of belonging, of being seen, of being understood. Yet the gap between his internal experiences and his external reality felt unbridgeable. He felt invisible, disconnected, a spectator in his own life. The final years of high school were a slow drift toward a breaking point. His drinking escalated. His isolation deepened. His sense of direction evaporated. While other students prepared for college, jobs, or futures full of possibility, Jeffrey moved through graduation with a quiet resignation, aware on some level that he was unprepared for the world beyond the school walls. He stood on the threshold of adulthood with no clear path, no emotional resilience, and no sense of who he was, or who he would become. Looking back, the warning signs were there: the retreat into isolation, the reliance on alcohol, the absence of emotional support, the unresolved trauma from a fractured home, the quiet fascination with control and anatomy, the social disconnection that left him feeling like an outsider in his own life. But at the time, these signs blended into the background of a troubled teenager's life, unnoticed by those around him. He was a quiet young man from a broken home, a boy who kept to himself, a boy slipping through the cracks of a system unprepared to catch him. And as Jeffrey left adolescence behind and stepped into early adulthood, the unresolved turmoil within him would soon collide with the pressures of independence, leading him down a path that would forever alter the lives of countless people and leave a permanent scar on American true crime history. Chapter 3: The First Murders, Crossing the Line. As Jeffrey Dahmer stepped out of adolescence and into the uncertain terrain of early adulthood, the emotional fractures that had shaped his youth began tightening around him, creating a pressure he could no longer contain. He graduated from high school in 1978, a milestone that most young people approached with excitement, but for Jeffrey, it marked the end of structure, the end of predictable days, and the beginning of a life he felt unprepared to navigate. His classmates moved into jobs, relationships, and plans for the future, while Jeffrey stood on uncertain ground, drifting between loneliness and confusion. His father, unaware of the depth of Jeffrey's internal struggles, encouraged him to find work or pursue further education, hoping responsibility might ground him. But the expectations only intensified Jeffrey's sense of inadequacy. He felt as though he was falling behind, not only in life's practical demands but in the emotional maturity needed to face them. And beneath it all, the loneliness he had carried for so long grew heavier, deeper, and more consuming. That summer, Lionel and Joyce finalized their separation, leaving Jeffrey's already fragile family life completely fractured. He found himself alone again, just as he had so many times during childhood, except now the solitude felt final, like he was standing on the edge of a world he didn't belong to. In June of that year, with the house empty around him and the silence pressing against his thoughts, Jeffrey encountered a 20-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks on a quiet rural road. What began as a simple interaction, two young men talking, sharing drinks, listening to music, became a moment of internal conflict for Jeffrey. Here was a person who stayed, who talked with him, who didn't judge or pull away. For someone who had spent his life feeling invisible, the sense of temporary connection carried enormous weight. But as the hours passed and Stephen prepared to leave, something in Jeffrey panicked at the thought of losing that brief sense of companionship. His emotions, fear of abandonment, desperation for control, confusion over his identity, all collided into a moment that defined a turning point in his life. What happened next marked Jeffrey's irreversible crossing from fantasy into action. It was not a moment of rage or premeditation, but of panic, fear, and overwhelming confusion. And afterward, as the reality of what he'd done settled over him, Jeffrey entered a state of shock, a numbness so deep that it felt disconnected from reality. Instead of running or seeking help, he moved mechanically, driven by instinct and fear, attempting to hide what had happened. His actions were clumsy, desperate, and fueled by terror, not only of being caught, but of facing the reality of what he had become. In the days that followed, Jeffrey's emotional landscape shifted. The guilt was there, but it was tangled with fear and the disturbing realization that he had felt a sense of control during the incident, a control he had never experienced in his life. That feeling frightened him, yet it also anchored itself quietly within him, a seed planted in the darkest part of his mind. He knew he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But instead of reaching out for help or confessing, he folded the entire experience into the same silence he had carried since childhood, burying it deep beneath layers of fear, alcohol, and emotional detachment. On the surface, he continued moving through life like the same quiet young man he had always been. Inside, he felt as though he were drifting into deeper waters with no ability to turn back. After the incident, Lionel pushed Jeffrey to make something of himself, unaware of the storm inside his son. Under pressure, Jeffrey enrolled at Ohio State University, but his drinking, already heavy, spiraled out of control. He skipped classes, flunked assignments, and spent most days isolated in his dorm room, lost in thoughts he didn't understand. His instructors described him as intelligent but unmotivated, withdrawn, and unreliable. The loneliness he'd carried since childhood seemed to expand in the large, impersonal campus environment, and his drinking became a way to quiet the memories that haunted him. Before long, his father withdrew him from college and delivered an ultimatum: either find discipline and structure or continue spiraling into failure. And so, in a decision rooted more in desperation than hope, Lionel encouraged Jeffrey to enlist in the United States Army. Military life offered routine, discipline, and clear expectations, elements Jeffrey had always struggled to find. At first, he tried to adapt, following orders, learning procedures, and attempting to blend into the camaraderie around him. But the emotional turmoil, the unresolved trauma, and the heavy drinking followed him into service. He performed adequately in technical tasks, but socially, he remained disconnected, awkward, and isolated. His drinking escalated again, creating conflicts and impairing his ability to function. Fellow soldiers noticed his odd behavior, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he seemed lost in thought even while performing basic duties. Eventually, the army determined that Jeffrey simply wasn't suited for military life, and he was honorably discharged. It was not a punishment, just an acknowledgement that he didn't fit in. But for Jeffrey, it felt like another failure, another confirmation that he didn't belong anywhere. After leaving the army, Jeffrey drifted aimlessly for a time, moving briefly to Florida before returning to Ohio at his father's urging. His drinking worsened, and his emotional state remained fragile. Lionel, searching for a solution, encouraged Jeffrey to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin, hoping that a stable, quiet home might give him the support he needed. For a time, it worked. His grandmother welcomed him warmly, offering the gentle presence his life had long lacked. Jeffrey found part-time work, kept up chores, and attended church with her. Neighbors described him as respectful and helpful, his employer found him quiet but dependable. The structure and affection of his grandmother's home created the closest thing Jeffrey had experienced to stability in years. Yet beneath the surface, nothing had truly resolved. The loneliness remained, the isolation persisted, and the memory of his first crime lingered like a shadow that followed him everywhere. He felt torn between wanting connection and fearing it, between craving companionship and pushing people away. The emotional void inside him deepened, and the strategies he used to numb that void, alcohol, withdrawal, ritualistic routines, began failing to contain the internal pressure. His attempts at normalcy slipped over time. He began staying out late, drinking heavily again, and withdrawing even from the soft comfort his grandmother offered. Tension rose as she noticed changes in his behavior, unexplained absences, strange smells, late-night wanderings, and a growing sense that Jeffrey was drifting into dangerous emotional territory. As Jeffrey entered his mid-20s, he found himself trapped between the desire to maintain the quiet life his grandmother believed he was building and the darker impulses that had been growing silently since adolescence. His social detachment, childhood trauma, identity confusion, and untreated emotional wounds converged into a storm he could no longer manage. And though he tried at times to bury the memories and push down the urges, the internal conflict grew stronger each passing month. The crossing of that first line in 1978, an impulsive, fear-driven moment, marked not just an isolated incident, but the beginning of an internal unraveling. It forged a path he never learned to step away from, a path shaped by silence, loneliness, fear, and a desperate longing for control. And as the weight of these unresolved struggles pressed on him, the boundaries between impulse and action began to blur once again. What started as a single moment of panic would soon evolve into a series of decisions that would shock Milwaukee, perplex investigators, and leave a permanent mark on American true crime history. Chapter 4: College, Rejection, and the Path to Darkness. As Jeffrey Dahmer entered early adulthood, the fragile structure holding his life together began to crumble under the weight of years of unresolved loneliness, mounting anxiety, and emotional detachment. After the first crime, a moment he buried beneath layers of silence, Jeffrey continued moving through life with a kind of quiet mechanical determination, trying to appear normal even as he drifted further into a dark internal world he could not explain. Encouraged by his father to pursue education, Jeffrey enrolled at Ohio State University, but the transition into college life only intensified the emotional instability he carried. The large, bustling campus, filled with students forming friendships, attending parties, and navigating typical freshman experiences, made Jeffrey feel more alienated than ever. He attended classes sporadically, often arriving late or not at all, drifting through corridors with vacant eyes and a hollowed-out sense of purpose. His dorm room became a solitary refuge where he spent most days avoiding interaction, trying to drown his thoughts with alcohol. Professors described him as intelligent but unfocused, a young man with potential but no direction, peers saw him as the quiet stranger who sat at the back of classrooms, disconnected from the world around him. Yet no one knew the extent to which Jeffrey was unraveling internally, caught between shame, fear, and the desperate attempt to suppress the memory of what he had done. His drinking escalated rapidly. What had once been a coping mechanism became a constant necessity, something he depended on just to get through the day. Bottles accumulated around his dorm room, hidden in drawers, backpacks, and closets, evidence of a young man spiraling deeper into self-destruction. He skipped exams, ignored assignments, and evaded responsibilities until his academic performance bottomed out. His father, noticing the decline, intervened, pulling Jeffrey out of school after only one semester. Lionel hoped that structure, any structure, might stabilize his son, but instead, Jeffrey returned home feeling like a failure, ashamed and directionless. With college behind him and no sense of belonging or future, he drifted aimlessly, burdened by secrecy and the emotional scars of his childhood. His father, increasingly frustrated, tried pushing him toward independence, urging him to find work or seek discipline through service. Eventually, Lionel suggested the army, believing military life might provide Jeffrey with stability, purpose, and responsibility. Jeffrey agreed, not out of aspiration but because he had nowhere else to turn. Boot camp provided temporary structure. Jeffrey followed orders, learned routines, and performed well enough to pass training. In the early weeks, the strict environment and physical activity helped distract him from the memories and urges that haunted him. Yet even in the military, his isolation persisted. He found it difficult to connect with fellow soldiers, his social awkwardness making interactions stiff and strained. Nighttime was the hardest. Left alone with his thoughts, Jeffrey began drinking again, sneaking alcohol whenever he could. The constant pressure of military expectations clashed with the deep emotional instability he carried, creating an internal tension he could not manage. While he showed competence in technical tasks, especially those requiring precision or attention to detail, his behavior gradually became erratic. Fellow soldiers noticed his increased drinking and strange mood shifts. Some saw him as quiet and harmless, others found him unsettling, unsure how to interpret his distant demeanor. Over time, his performance deteriorated, and the army concluded he was incompatible with the demands of service. In 1981, Jeffrey was discharged, not dishonorably, not punitively, but because he didn't fit. For Jeffrey, the discharge reinforced what he had feared all along. That he was incapable of belonging anywhere. After leaving the army, he moved briefly to Miami, hoping a change in environment would offer a fresh start. The Florida sun, the beaches, and the constant flow of tourists created a stark contrast to the gray Midwest atmosphere he had known all his life. He found work at a sandwich shop and rented a room near the beach, but the internal turmoil followed him like a shadow. His drinking escalated, draining what little money he earned. He spent nights wandering aimlessly, unable to sleep, unable to connect with anyone. Eventually, finances collapsed, and he was forced to contact his father for help. Lionel, trying once again to salvage his son's life, asked Jeffrey to return to Ohio. The reunion was strained. Jeffrey was ashamed, embarrassed, and still hiding the darkest secret of his life. His father, unaware, focused only on finding a place where Jeffrey might receive stability. That place turned out to be West Allis, Wisconsin, where Jeffrey moved in with his grandmother. His grandmother, a deeply religious woman with a stable, quiet home, welcomed Jeffrey warmly. For a time, her gentle presence provided the closest thing to comfort he had experienced since childhood. He attended church with her, performed chores, and found part-time work at a local chocolate factory. Neighbors described him as polite, reserved, always willing to lend a hand. His grandmother adored him, proud to have her grandson under her roof. The stability seemed to help. Jeffrey kept his drinking somewhat in check, maintained his job, and tried to mask the internal chaos with routine. Yet these moments of calm were fragile, held together by thin threads of self-control. Inside, he remained deeply conflicted, lonely, emotionally disconnected, unsure of his identity, and haunted by memories he never confronted. The combination of alcohol, secrecy, and unresolved trauma created a dangerous emotional landscape, one that grew more unstable with each passing month. During this period, Jeffrey began frequenting bars and bathhouses in Milwaukee, quietly exploring his identity while struggling to reconcile his desires with overwhelming shame and confusion. He longed for connection but feared vulnerability, he sought companionship but recoiled from intimacy. This internal conflict left him trapped between wanting to belong and wanting to disappear. As the emotional strain intensified, he retreated further into solitary routines, seeking comfort in control, predictability, and the ability to dictate every outcome of his environment. His nights grew restless, filled with wandering, drinking, and thoughts that followed him everywhere he went. His behavior at home shifted in subtle ways that his grandmother noticed but didn't fully understand: the late-night outings, the sudden mood swings, the strange smells from the garage, the increasing secrecy. She loved him deeply but had no idea how to intervene or what questions to ask. The tipping point began with loneliness, the same loneliness that had followed him since childhood, the same loneliness that had grown deeper after the first crime, the same loneliness that no environment, no routine, no temporary stability could erase. Jeffrey felt himself slipping, losing control, losing the ability to suppress the urges and impulses that had grown in the shadows of his mind. He tried pushing the thoughts away, tried numbing them with alcohol, tried distracting himself with work and routine. But nothing lasted. The emotional void demanded resolution. The sense of isolation demanded relief. And the memory of what he had done years earlier returned not just as a haunting regret, but as a dangerous reminder of a moment when he had felt control, connection, and power, all things he lacked in every other part of his life. The line he had crossed as a teenager, the moment he had spent years burying, resurfaced as a possibility again, not from rage, but from desperation. And as Jeffrey drifted further into emotional isolation, the fragile balance he had maintained collapsed. The path he had tried to avoid, the one shaped by trauma, silence, and loneliness, began pulling him forward again. The unraveling was quiet, almost invisible to those around him. His grandmother saw only sadness. His co-workers saw only a shy young man. His neighbors saw only politeness. No one recognized the storm building behind his calm exterior. Jeffrey's return to violence did not happen suddenly. It was the culmination of years of unaddressed trauma, growing urges, emotional disconnection, and a need for control that had been forming since childhood. And as the pressure inside him intensified, the boundaries between thought and action began dissolving once more. What started as a fractured childhood had now evolved into an internal struggle that Jeffrey could no longer contain. And soon, the quiet suburbs of Wisconsin, and eventually, the city of Milwaukee, would find themselves touched by a darkness no one saw coming. Chapter 5: Life in Milwaukee, a Quiet Neighbor. When Jeffrey Dahmer eventually left his grandmother's home and moved into Milwaukee, the transition marked the beginning of a period where the contrast between his inner world and his outer appearance became sharper than ever before. To the public, Jeffrey seemed like an average young man trying to build a modest life, quiet, polite, unobtrusive, and rarely the cause of any trouble. In a working-class city filled with people going about their daily routines, factory workers, bus drivers, bartenders, neighbors tending to small apartments, Jeffrey blended into the background seamlessly. He found work at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, taking up a late-night shift that kept him isolated from others and offered a structured routine that made him feel at least marginally functional. Co-workers remembered him as quiet, shy, sometimes even painfully soft-spoken. He rarely joined social gatherings, choosing instead to return home after shifts, retreating into a silence that felt both comforting and isolating. His landlord considered him low maintenance, someone who paid rent on time, never caused disturbances, and barely spoke beyond polite nods. To neighbors, he was simply that quiet guy on the second floor, a figure easy to forget. And that forgettability became one of the most dangerous aspects of his life. Wrapped in a shy exterior and steady employment, Jeffrey's public persona was that of an unremarkable young man doing his best to stay afloat. But inside his small apartment, the facade of normalcy existed only in appearance. Jeffrey's loneliness, which had shadowed him since childhood, became almost suffocating in Milwaukee. The move provided independence, but it also amplified the isolation that had long shaped his emotional world. The city around him pulsed with life, bars filled with laughter, streets lit with neon signs, and people forming relationships he could only observe from the outside. He watched the world move effortlessly around him, feeling simultaneously invisible and overwhelmed. His drinking worsened, becoming routine rather than occasional. He often started drinking before work, continued after, and relied on alcohol to silence the memories and urges he couldn't control. Night after night, he sat alone in his dim apartment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the muffled sounds of the city. In those hours, the loneliness became unbearable, pushing him deeper into a state of emotional numbing that alcohol could not fully soothe. At the same time, Jeffrey began returning to old patterns, seeking companionship and connection in bars across Milwaukee. But the interactions often felt strained, confusing, and emotionally overwhelming. He struggled to communicate honestly, to express vulnerability, or to build genuine connection. Instead, he clung to the idea of control over situations, control over outcomes, control over whether someone stayed or left. His fear of abandonment, rooted in childhood trauma and years of emotional neglect, had grown into a fixation. When people left, it reopened every wound he had never healed. And so, Jeffrey began crafting elaborate internal fantasies, imagining scenarios where companionship was permanent, where no one walked away, where he could hold on to someone without fear of rejection. These fantasies consumed him, quietly shaping his thoughts and influencing the way he viewed every interaction. Even at work, where he performed tasks methodically, co-workers noticed moments when Jeffrey seemed distant or lost in thought. He would stare into space, silent and motionless, as though trapped in an internal world he couldn't escape. When asked simple questions, he sometimes responded slowly, as if pulled back from somewhere far away. Supervisors recognized that he did his job reliably, but they also sensed something withdrawn about him, an emptiness that didn't match his polite demeanor. But in a busy factory, where most workers focused on their own tasks and lives, Jeffrey's emotional distance went unnoticed. People assumed he was shy. People assumed he was introverted. People assumed he was lonely but harmless. And Jeffrey relied on those assumptions to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. Milwaukee provided a degree of anonymity that Jeffrey had never experienced. In a city big enough to blend into, he found comfort in the idea that nobody asked too many questions. Neighbors didn't pry. Co-workers didn't probe. Bartenders saw him as just another quiet customer. Yet this anonymity also allowed his internal struggles to grow unchecked. He lived with few responsibilities and minimal accountability, functioning just enough to avoid suspicion. His grandmother had once provided gentle structure and emotional presence, but now, living alone, Jeffrey found himself without any stabilizing influence. His days blurred together, working late shifts, numbing himself with alcohol, wandering through the city's nightlife, and returning to an apartment that felt both like a hiding place and a prison. His emotional world fractured further as he attempted to navigate his identity. He longed for connection yet feared vulnerability. He wanted companionship yet recoiled from intimacy. He desired closeness yet felt unable to handle the emotional complexity it required. These contradictions created a storm inside him, pulling him in opposing directions he couldn't reconcile. As his loneliness deepened, the fantasies grew stronger, evolving from passive daydreams into intrusive thoughts. He tried fighting them, sometimes attempting sobriety or trying to distract himself with television, reading, or pacing through his apartment. But nothing alleviated the pressure building within him. Without emotional support, therapy, or meaningful connections, he began slipping into patterns of behavior that blurred the boundary between fantasy and reality. Jeffrey's drinking further destabilized him, making it harder to think logically, control impulses, or maintain a stable sense of self. Nights became unpredictable. He wandered farther from home, frequented more bars, and sought temporary company that left him feeling even more alone afterward. Alcohol became the only thing that could quiet the noise in his mind, even if only for a few hours. But the relief never lasted. Every morning he woke up feeling emptier, more detached, and increasingly frustrated with his inability to maintain a normal life. He often stared at himself in the bathroom mirror, studying his reflection with a mixture of disdain and numbness, wondering why he couldn't be like everyone else, why he couldn't connect, why he couldn't escape the darkness that clung to him. As his emotional instability grew sharper, his behavior in Milwaukee became subtly more concerning. His drinking escalated to dangerous levels. He began missing work occasionally, arriving late, or showing signs of withdrawal. He avoided phone calls from family, preferring isolation even when he felt desperate for connection. Neighbors noticed strange sounds at night or the occasional smell from his apartment, but they dismissed it as part of city living. Jeffrey's presence remained quiet and unremarkable. People saw what they expected to see, a lonely young man trying to get by. But they couldn't see the internal world, fractured by trauma, shaped by fantasy, and fueled by an overwhelming need for control, that governed his every decision. During this period, Jeffrey's sense of self deteriorated. He moved through Milwaukee like a shadow, functioning just enough to maintain a job but emotionally detached from everything around him. The unresolved wounds of his childhood, abandonment, humiliation, isolation, deepened into a psychological landscape that felt impossible to navigate. And the longer he lived alone, the more those internal pressures mounted, pushing him toward a breaking point that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He tried suppressing the urges, tried drowning them in alcohol, tried going through the motions of normal life. But the internal tension grew impossible to ignore. By the late 1980s, Jeffrey had become an expert at appearing ordinary. He smiled politely at neighbors, offered casual greetings to coworkers, and blended effortlessly into the city's rhythms. But beneath the surface, the loneliness, confusion, and internal chaos had become unbearable. His small apartment, cluttered, dim, filled with empty bottles, reflected the unraveling state of his mind. The fragile sense of control he had maintained for years began slipping away. And with no one to talk to, no emotional anchor, and no treatment for his growing psychological instability, Jeffrey found himself inching closer toward a darkness he had once tried desperately to avoid. Milwaukee saw only a quiet neighbor. A shy worker. A polite young man. But inside Jeffrey Dahmer's mind, the emotional storm that had begun in childhood had now become a full collapse. The unraveling was no longer subtle. The boundaries between impulse and restraint were nearly gone. And soon, the quiet life he had worked so hard to project would break open, revealing the shadows he had carried all along. Chapter 6, Patterns Emerge, the Method Behind the Madness. As Jeffrey Dahmer settled into his life in Milwaukee, the emotional instability that had been simmering beneath the surface for years began coiling tighter, shaping the private world he kept hidden behind the polite nods and quiet demeanor his neighbors saw. The loneliness he carried, deep, persistent, and rooted in childhood, continued to expand inside him until it became almost unbearable, and the heavy drinking he relied on to numb that emptiness only clouded his mind further, blurring judgment, loosening restraint, and feeding the fantasies he had fought to suppress. The fantasy world that Jeffrey had built over years was no longer a fleeting escape, it had become a central part of his inner life, a place he retreated to when reality felt too overwhelming to manage. These fantasies were not impulsive or explosive but slowly constructed over time, crafted from the same emotional wounds that had always shaped him, his fear of abandonment, his isolation, and his longing for connection without the risk of rejection. And as his emotional control weakened, the boundary between fantasy and action began to dissolve in a quiet, almost invisible way. His patterns didn't emerge as sudden bursts of chaos but as a calculated, ritualistic series of behaviors rooted in his deep desire to create an environment where he could feel complete control. Every action, every detail, became part of a routine shaped by the internal forces he couldn't silence. At first, Jeffrey tried to rely on the nightlife around him to find temporary distraction: bars, bathhouses, clubs, places where he hoped proximity to others might soothe the loneliness that overwhelmed him. But each time he returned home alone, the emptiness returned stronger, reminding him of everything he couldn't maintain in his daily life. He felt disconnected from real relationships, emotionally out of sync, unable to form bonds that required vulnerability or trust. Instead of seeking help or confiding in anyone, Jeffrey retreated further into himself. He began experimenting with ways to control the environment around him, first through small, almost insignificant behaviors that gave him the illusion of power. He rearranged objects carefully, kept certain items in strict places, and created small rituals that allowed him to feel, even temporarily, that his world was organized and predictable. These rituals slowly expanded into more elaborate internal structures, shaping the way he thought about connection, intimacy, and companionship. He reached a point where the idea of someone choosing to stay willingly seemed impossible to him, because he believed he lacked the emotional tools to maintain a relationship. His self-worth was so fractured that he equated connection with control, affection with possession, and companionship with permanence. In his mind, the only way to avoid being abandoned was to make sure no one ever had the opportunity to leave. This belief grew quietly inside him, tightening like a knot, shaping every thought that followed. His nights became a cycle of wandering, drinking, searching, and returning home to a deeper loneliness than before. He frequented more bars, seeking faces that sparked the fantasies he had been living inside for years. The more he drank, the less he distinguished between reality and desire. His emotional compass no longer guided him toward connection but toward control, toward reenacting the fantasies that had been forming since adolescence. Patterns emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly, even to himself. He began seeking individuals who appeared isolated, vulnerable, or overlooked, people he believed would stay with him longer, talk with him, fill the silent void that had consumed him since childhood. At first, Jeffrey approached these interactions with the hope of companionship, but his internal conflict, between wanting someone and fearing they would leave, kept twisting every attempt at connection into a source of anxiety. He felt terrified of losing people, even when he barely knew them. The fear of abandonment became an obsession, a force that guided the rituals forming in his mind. Alcohol loosened that fear just enough for him to act. It clouded judgment, dissolved hesitation, and made the fantasies feel not only possible, but inevitable. He convinced himself that controlling the situation was the only way to avoid the emotional pain he had endured his entire life. These thoughts solidified into rituals, methods that made him feel stable, even when the stability was built on the darkest parts of his psyche. He began forming routines around who he chose, what he said, how he prepared, and how he managed the environment of his small apartment. His actions were not spontaneous, but planned, quietly, methodically, and shaped by the internal logic of someone who had spent decades trapped in emotional isolation. These routines provided him with a sense of order he couldn't find anywhere else. Control became his way of coping. Control became his substitute for intimacy. Control became the answer to every emotional fracture he carried. And as these patterns grew stronger, they pushed him further down a path he no longer had the ability, or willingness, to escape. Chapter 6, Patterns Emerge. The the method behind the madness. As these rituals solidified, Jeffrey's internal world grew even more rigid, shaped by the need to control both his environment and the outcomes of his interactions. What began as subtle routines soon evolved into deliberate methods that governed nearly every encounter he pursued. He learned to speak softly, to appear harmless, to use his quiet demeanor as a shield that concealed the turmoil inside him. His outward politeness became a mask he wore so naturally that most people never questioned it. He moved through the bars and streets of Milwaukee with the unremarkable presence of someone who seemed too shy, too gentle, too reserved to pose any threat. And this invisibility worked in his favor. He took mental notes: which spots were busiest, which were quiet, which created opportunities for conversation or solitude. He watched faces, studied body language, and observed who seemed open to company, who felt overlooked, who might accept a drink or a brief conversation. These weren't decisions made impulsively, they were patterns that formed slowly, driven by a deep sense of emotional hunger and a nearly obsessive need for control. Each encounter, each decision, each routine became part of a system he refined over time, building a structure in his mind that offered him the illusion of stability and predictability. The patterns became so ingrained that Jeffrey eventually moved through them with the same automatic ease that he followed at his factory job: methodical, consistent, and deeply detached from emotion. The more isolated he felt, the more dependent he became on these routines. He would spend long nights sitting alone in his apartment, drinking heavily, pacing back and forth as he replayed memories and imagined scenarios where no one left him, no one abandoned him, no one slipped away the moment the sun rose. He feared being alone as much as he feared rejection, and these conflicting desires fused into a distorted understanding of companionship. In his mind, affection became something that could only exist if he had complete control. And as the fantasies grew stronger, so did his willingness to act on them. His drinking was not merely a habit but a tool, something he relied on to quiet his conscience, silence the internal warning signs, and push him toward the rituals that had begun to define his nights. He convinced himself that he was not dangerous, that he was only seeking company, that the emptiness he carried justified the decisions he made. But beneath these rationalizations was a deeper truth: his emotional world had collapsed into a state where control felt necessary for survival. And once he stepped fully into this mindset, the patterns hardened into something much darker. Jeffrey also became increasingly careful in the way he chose locations, times, and situations. He learned which streets were quiet after midnight, which bars were less likely to attract attention, which parts of the city allowed him to move unnoticed. The city's late-night culture, its dim lights, crowded rooms, and shifting faces, allowed him to blend in without effort. To strangers, he was just another solitary figure wandering through the night. But inside, Jeffrey was taking mental inventory, analyzing details, adjusting his routines, and reinforcing the internal logic that shaped his method. Over time, he developed a calculated approach to managing the emotional storm inside him. He learned how to detach himself completely, becoming almost robotic in the way he carried out his rituals. His calm voice, vacant expression, and slow, deliberate movements made him appear harmless, even vulnerable. And because he looked so unthreatening, his presence rarely raised suspicion. While the world around him continued at its usual pace, neighbors going to work, families shopping for groceries, patrons filling bars on weekends, Jeffrey felt himself drifting further into an internal space where reality mattered less than the predictable patterns he could control. His loneliness intensified, but instead of seeking help, he isolated himself even more. His apartment became the center of his life, a place where he could retreat from the outside world and hide the emotional chaos that consumed him. He kept the lights dim, the windows closed, and the furniture arranged to his liking. He surrounded himself with objects that felt familiar, creating a space that reflected the rigid order he craved. The rest of the world felt unpredictable and overwhelming, but inside his apartment, he could shape his environment exactly the way he wanted. Even at work, the patterns followed him. He maintained a strict schedule, arriving on time, working methodically, completing tasks with quiet efficiency. His co-workers saw him as dependable, even if distant. No one questioned the long nights or the tired expression he often carried. No one looked beyond the surface to see the emotional deterioration happening beneath his calm exterior. And because he functioned just well enough to avoid drawing attention, he went largely unnoticed. This ability to maintain a facade, while hiding the storm inside, became one of the most dangerous aspects of his life. It allowed him to continue refining his methods without interference, to develop routines without suspicion, and to pursue his fantasies without anyone recognizing the signs of unraveling. As his patterns strengthened, Jeffrey's emotional detachment deepened. The more he relied on control, the less he connected with the outside world. People became symbols rather than individuals, representations of companionship, warmth, comfort, or stability, things he could not attain through normal relationships. The idea of someone choosing to stay with him felt impossible, so he created a world in which they didn't have to choose. He constructed a system where leaving wasn't an option. And as this belief solidified, it became the driving force behind his actions. The path Jeffrey followed was not impulsive, nor was it born from bursts of chaotic rage. It was slow, deliberate, calculated, and rooted in decades of emotional wounds that had never healed. His method emerged from silence, loneliness, and an overwhelming desire to control the relationships he was unable to form naturally. And once the patterns were fully shaped, once the rituals had become part of his identity, Jeffrey Dahmer crossed another quiet threshold, one that would bring Milwaukee into the center of a case unlike anything the city had ever seen. Chapter 7: Victims and Vanishing, a City Unaware. As the 1980s unfolded, Milwaukee moved through its usual rhythm: factory whistles at dawn, buses rumbling through crowded intersections, the smell of fried food drifting from corner diners, completely unaware that a quiet storm was forming within the city's shadows. People lived their lives with routine familiarity, trusting the same sidewalks, gathering in the same bars, passing the same faces without suspicion. And woven into that everyday landscape was Jeffrey Dahmer, a man who walked unnoticed through the same streets, carrying an internal darkness that grew more structured, more confident, and more deeply rooted with each passing month. The patterns he had built in silence were now merging with opportunity, introspection blending with impulse, loneliness merging with a need for control. His methods, once tentative, shaped by fear and confusion, were sharpening into something coldly ritualistic. He knew which bars were dimly lit, which neighborhoods were quiet after midnight, which corners offered anonymity. He learned how to blend seamlessly into the city's nightlife, where the shifting lights and crowded rooms allowed him to observe without being observed. Milwaukee's late-night culture created a kind of cover: people moved quickly, exchanged fleeting glances, drifted in and out of conversation, and rarely paid attention to the quiet man sitting alone with a drink. Jeffrey's presence didn't command attention. If anything, it repelled it, not out of fear, but because he seemed so ordinary, so reserved, that he became part of the background. While the city moved through its nightly routines, individuals began disappearing, quietly, without warning, without the alarms that usually accompany sudden vanishings. These disappearances were not connected at first. The victims came from different neighborhoods, different circumstances, different struggles. Some had strained relationships with family, some moved often, some lived in communities where going missing didn't always generate immediate concern. And so, when they vanished, their absence didn't spark citywide panic. Instead, each disappearance was folded into existing assumptions: runaways, relocations, temporary absences. Milwaukee, like many cities, had learned to normalize uncertainty, especially when it came to young men who drifted in and out of the city's nightlife. But behind those quiet vanishings was a calculated system Jeffrey had been perfecting. His methods were not chaotic, they were deliberate. He observed body language carefully, noting who seemed isolated or overlooked. He listened for the tone of someone's voice, the hesitations in their sentences, the signs of someone who might accept a drink or a conversation without suspicion. He approached gently, offering a sense of safety and friendliness that felt genuine to those he encountered. His soft voice, his shy demeanor, his polite manner. These traits disarmed people. They made him appear vulnerable, even harmless. And because he looked harmless, his presence raised no alarms. Each encounter began the same way: quiet conversation, the offer of a drink, the calm invitation to listen to music or hang out for a while. There was no rush, no urgency. Jeffrey's method relied on patience, on creating a sense of ease that lowered defenses. He didn't act impulsively, he built trust, or at least the illusion of it. This patience became one of his most effective tools, allowing him to appear genuine even as his inner world swirled with fantasies shaped by decades of emotional isolation. As disappearances slowly accumulated, their connection remained invisible. Milwaukee in the late 1980s did not have extensive tracking systems for missing adults, and information often stayed isolated within neighborhoods or families rather than reaching broader networks. Some victims weren't reported missing immediately. Others weren't reported at all. This created a dangerous gap, one Jeffrey moved through effortlessly, exploiting the spaces where society failed to notice its own members slipping away. Inside his small apartment, Jeffrey's routines became more ritualistic, more structured, and more emotionally consuming. He developed methods for controlling every detail of the interactions that took place behind closed doors, creating an environment where he could shape the situation according to the fantasies he had lived with for years. His internal logic, distorted by trauma, loneliness, and fear, justified each decision he made. In his mind, these actions were a way to fill the emptiness that seemed impossible to escape. He believed he was building a stable world for himself, one where he could avoid the pain of abandonment and maintain the illusion of companionship. And the more he relied on these rituals, the further he drifted from any remaining sense of moral restraint. Yet in public, nothing changed. He still showed up for work. He still nodded politely to neighbors. He still sat quietly on buses, blending into the background with the same unremarkable presence that had defined him for years. The duality became striking: a man who could appear calm, gentle, and almost painfully introverted, while carrying the weight of actions that would eventually shock the nation. What made these events even more haunting was the proximity of everyday life to Jeffrey's private world. Neighbors passed him in hallways without a second thought. Store clerks handed him groceries. Bus drivers picked him up on late-night routes. Individuals brushed shoulders with him on crowded sidewalks. He attended family events occasionally, offering quiet smiles and short responses, giving no indication of the internal storms shaping his nights. Milwaukee, unaware of the darkness developing behind closed doors, continued living its life undisturbed. People walked their dogs past his building. Children played in nearby yards. Music drifted from open windows in summer. Within this seemingly ordinary environment, Jeffrey operated without scrutiny, his pattern strengthening as his emotional detachment deepened. The vanishings continued, slowly, quietly, each one slipping into a city that struggled to track its missing, especially when those individuals already lived on the margins of society. By the time patterns began to emerge on paper, the reality had already taken shape in Jeffrey's mind. His method had become part of who he was, a carefully constructed system built from years of abandonment, fear, and isolation. And while Milwaukee still saw only a quiet factory worker living a modest life in a small apartment, the truth was beginning to darken beneath that unremarkable exterior. The city remained unaware. The danger remained invisible. And Jeffrey Dahmer continued walking through Milwaukee's nights, unseen even by those who stood inches away from him. And as Jeffrey Dahmer continued moving through Milwaukee's nighttime currents with the same soft-spoken manner and downcast eyes, the disappearances around him accumulated like quiet echoes that no one could yet trace back to a single source. The city's police force, stretched thin by rising crime and limited communication systems, struggled to recognize patterns in cases that often crossed neighborhood lines, social circles, and communities that rarely interacted. Each missing young man seemed to vanish into a different pocket of the city, making the disappearances feel isolated rather than connected. For families waiting at home, unanswered phone calls turned into sleepless nights, and sleepless nights turned into frantic searches for loved ones who never returned. But their fears often remained contained within households or small communities, their pleas for answers lost in the noise of a city that had grown accustomed to people drifting in and out of its streets. Milwaukee in the late 1980s had no centralized system for tracking missing adults, and information moved slowly, sometimes not at all, making it nearly impossible to see the larger picture forming just beyond the city's awareness. While the city searched for its lost sons in scattered, uncoordinated ways, Jeffrey navigated his days with a steady monotony that betrayed nothing of his internal world. At work, he performed his duties with predictable reliability, clocking in quietly, completing tasks with mechanical precision, and clocking out without lingering too long in conversation. His supervisors considered him dependable, if somewhat withdrawn. His co-workers barely noticed him, seeing him as the type of person who preferred solitude over small talk. To neighbors, he was polite, soft-voiced, unassuming, and rarely disruptive. They passed him in hallways and laundromats, unaware of the emotional turmoil hidden behind his subdued expressions. Even when he appeared disheveled or tired, most chalked it up to long work hours or personal stress, never suspecting the truth unfolding behind the door of apartment 213. Inside that apartment, Jeffrey's emotional world had spiraled into something far more detached from reality than even he fully understood. The rituals he developed in earlier years had solidified into a rigid internal system, one that governed everything from how he arranged objects to how he navigated each encounter. He crafted routines that made sense only within the isolated landscape of his mind, routines shaped by the obsessive need to control outcomes and the deep fear of losing anyone who entered his life. It was a fragile system held together by alcohol, fantasy, and detachment. The emotional fractures of his childhood, feelings of abandonment, humiliation, and inadequacy, had grown into a psychological structure that left him unable to distinguish genuine connection from possession. In his mind, the disappearances were not acts of cruelty but desperate attempts to fill the void that had consumed him for as long as he could remember. Yet beneath that distorted logic, Jeffrey remained terrified of drawing attention. He knew that any disruption, any noise, any complaint from a neighbor, any unexpected visit, could unravel everything. This fear kept him obsessively cautious. He kept the apartment door locked at all times. He avoided loud arguments or disturbances. He moved carefully, cleaning meticulously, maintaining a calm demeanor even when his internal storm threatened to break. His ability to appear outwardly composed became one of his greatest tools. The contrast between his inner world and the facade he showed others grew sharper, more defined, until the Jeffrey his neighbors believed they saw was nothing more than a quiet mask worn with practiced ease. Some neighbors did grow uneasy. Strange smells occasionally seeped into the hallway, prompting complaints. Heavy thuds or odd noises were sometimes heard late at night. But every time Jeffrey was confronted, he responded with the same gentle politeness, explaining that his refrigerator had broken, or that he had spilled food, or that he was storing expired meat. His soft voice, nervous smile, and apologetic manner disarmed almost everyone. They believed him because he seemed believable. They trusted him because he appeared trustworthy. They assumed he was simply a shy young man doing his best to live quietly in a small apartment building. And Jeffrey relied on that assumption, nurturing it carefully each time he was forced to mend suspicion with calm excuses. Meanwhile, the disappearances continued to ripple through Milwaukee's communities, creating an undercurrent of quiet fear that never quite reached a breaking point. Families waited by windows, hoping for familiar footsteps. Missing posters clung to telephone poles, their edges curling under the weight of humidity and time. Some families pleaded with police, demanding more action, but the lack of clear evidence and the gaps in communication made it difficult for authorities to piece together anything coherent. Each case existed in a silo, without awareness that dozens of other families were asking the same questions, grieving the same silence, wondering how their child or friend or sibling could vanish without a trace. Through all of this, Jeffrey felt the world narrowing around him. His isolation grew more intense. His rituals consumed more of his time. His reliance on alcohol deepened, creating a haze through which he moved night after night. Yet despite the emotional turmoil eating away at him, he still managed to show up for work, attend family gatherings on rare occasions, and navigate the city streets with the same quiet demeanor that had always concealed the truth. He lived a double existence, one visible to the world and one known only to himself. The more he indulged the internal world he had built, the less connected he felt to reality, drifting through days like a ghost inhabiting a life that was no longer entirely his own. By the late 1980s, Milwaukee had reached a point where fear simmered beneath the surface, but no one yet understood the scope of what was happening. The vanishings were still seen as coincidences, the complaints about strange smells still dismissed as minor annoyances, and the quiet young man in apartment 213 still viewed as harmless. The city was unaware that the patterns Jeffrey had been shaping for over a decade, patterns built from loneliness, obsession, and emotional disintegration, were reaching a point where they could no longer remain hidden. The storm was still silent. But it was growing. And soon, Milwaukee would learn the truth behind the disappearances that had slowly, quietly haunted its streets. Chapter 8, The House of Horrors, Secrets Behind Closed Doors. As the 1980s drew to a close and Milwaukee settled into the slower rhythm of a new decade, Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, Unit 213 of the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street, became the center of a quiet darkness that escaped nearly everyone's attention. From the outside, the building looked like any other low-income complex in the city, a faded structure with rusting railings, peeling paint, and the constant hum of old appliances. People came and went carrying groceries, laundry baskets, or fast food bags. Radios played behind closed doors. Couples argued. Children ran down the hallways. It was an environment where anonymity came naturally. People lived close together physically, yet remained emotionally distant, wrapped in their own worries and routines. In this setting, Jeffrey's quiet presence blended in perfectly. No one questioned the soft-spoken man who kept to himself, paid rent on time, and rarely caused trouble. But behind the thin door of apartment 213, a world had formed that existed entirely separate from the city outside, an isolated universe built from loneliness, ritual, and emotional disintegration. Every detail of the apartment reflected Jeffrey's fractured inner world, the dim lighting, the cluttered counters, the half-emptied bottles, the handwritten notes, and the items arranged with obsessive precision. Jeffrey had crafted his own environment of control, a place where he felt shielded from the chaos of life and comforted by the familiarity of his routines. It was the one space where he didn't feel abandoned, rejected, or overwhelmed, because he controlled every inch of it. To outsiders, Jeffrey's apartment seemed unremarkable, one of many units in a noisy building filled with people trying to get by. But neighbors occasionally noticed unusual sounds or odors drifting from his door, the low hum of a saw, the clatter of something heavy dropping against the floor, or the sharp, sour smell that lingered in the hallway long after Jeffrey closed his door. When confronted, Jeffrey responded with practiced politeness and disarming explanations. He blamed his refrigerator, spoiled meat, or malfunctioning appliances. His quiet, almost timid demeanor made his excuses believable. He apologized softly, promising to fix the issue, and neighbors, already busy with their own problems, simply accepted the explanation and moved on. No one imagined that anything truly strange could be happening behind the door of such a polite, almost forgettable neighbor. And Jeffrey relied on that trust, nurturing it with every gentle smile and every calm apology. Inside, his emotional world had collapsed into something deeply detached from reality. He felt both isolated and trapped, craving connection yet recoiling from the vulnerability it required. His routines, once developed out of fear and loneliness, had hardened into a rigid internal system that guided every choice he made. He arranged items in specific places. He maintained strict habits. He created rituals that reflected his need for total control. This wasn't chaos, it was order, an order shaped by a mind struggling to make sense of decades of emotional pain. Jeffrey no longer felt like he could function outside the confines of apartment 213, the world beyond his door overwhelmed him. He moved through days in a haze of alcohol and psychological numbness, using his routines to create a fragile sense of stability. Each time he returned home from work or from wandering Milwaukee streets, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The apartment was his sanctuary, his fortress, his hiding place from the disappointments of the outside world. At the same time, the apartment amplified his isolation. The more he retreated into its dimly lit rooms, the more disconnected he became from anything resembling normal life. His interactions with coworkers became shorter. His conversations with family dwindled. His interest in daily responsibilities faded. He missed work more frequently, often calling out due to heavy drinking or sleepless nights. His emotional detachment grew so intense that even mundane tasks, washing dishes, folding clothes, taking out the trash, felt overwhelming. The only structure he maintained with any consistency were the rituals inside his private world, routines shaped by fantasy rather than reality. These rituals were not spontaneous impulses but long-standing desires that had been forming since adolescence. They were woven from the same emotional wounds that had pushed him into isolation: fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of losing control. His need for permanence, twisted by trauma and loneliness, fueled the routines that defined his nights. And as the emotional pressure built inside him, the apartment became both the stage and the symbol of his psychological collapse. Despite the strange smells and occasional noises, most neighbors paid little attention. The Oxford apartments were known as a place where privacy mattered and boundaries were rarely crossed. People learned to mind their own business, to avoid unnecessary conflict, to let neighbors maintain whatever secrets they carried. And Jeffrey depended on that unspoken rule. He lived in a building where crying infants, loud arguments, and mystery odors were common. The chaos of urban living masked the signs that something far more unsettling was happening in one small unit on the second floor. Even when neighbors knocked on his door to complain, they left feeling mild annoyance rather than fear. Jeffrey's explanations, paired with his gentle voice and awkward smile, diffused tension effortlessly. He always appeared embarrassed, even apologetic, and that vulnerability made him seem harmless. Meanwhile, Milwaukee's disappearances continued. Young men vanished at a pace that should have raised alarms, but the city's fragmented communication systems kept the cases isolated. Detectives saw individual vanishings rather than part of a larger pattern. Families waited for phone calls that never came. Posters hung on convenience store windows and telephone poles, curling from humidity, their photographs slowly fading. But each poster represented a life that had been swallowed without a sound, each one connected to a quiet apartment where Jeffrey Dahmer drifted deeper into emotional chaos. And yet, he still maintained a semblance of functionality. He bought groceries. He attended work, when he could. He visited bars. He rode the city bus. He stopped at corner stores for beer. To the casual observer, he looked like someone struggling with alcohol, maybe loneliness, but nothing extraordinary. He wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't disruptive. This ordinary appearance, the soft-spoken neighbor with tired eyes, kept suspicion at bay even as the truth grew too large to remain hidden much longer. And as Jeffrey's world shrank further into the dim corners of apartment 213, the boundaries between his fantasies and his reality became increasingly blurred, creating a psychological pressure that left him more detached, more dependent on routine, and more terrified of losing control than ever before. His emotional isolation deepened to a level where days drifted together in a haze, beer cans filling the trash, the television buzzing quietly in the background, and the blinds pulled tight against the sunlight he no longer cared to see. He was slipping into a state where the apartment felt less like a home and more like the only universe he could tolerate, a fragile bubble where the outside world could not intrude unless he allowed it. And the longer he stayed inside that bubble, the harder it became to function anywhere else. Even simple tasks, answering the phone, attending work, going to the store, began to feel overwhelming, like challenges too heavy for someone whose mind no longer fit the rhythm of everyday life. Jeffrey's ability to maintain the facade of normalcy was still intact, but beneath the surface he was unraveling quietly, drifting through each day with an increasing sense of numbness and detachment. His behavior grew more erratic in ways that hid easily beneath the noise of apartment living. The strange smells became more frequent, seeping into hallways and stairwells, prompting neighbors to complain with growing frustration. Yet each time someone knocked, Jeffrey opened the door with the same soft-spoken apology, the same downcast expression, the same explanation about spoiled meat or malfunctioning appliances. And while neighbors left dissatisfied, they rarely left suspicious. They saw him as disorganized, lonely, maybe struggling with depression, but never dangerous. Apartment living created a veil. People learned not to ask too many questions, not to get involved in their neighbors' personal struggles, not to assume the worst when something smelled wrong or sounded strange. That veil allowed Jeffrey's routines to continue unnoticed. It allowed him to maintain a world built from secrecy and isolation, a world where every door locked from the inside and every ritual remained hidden behind drawn blinds. Jeffrey himself understood how fragile that secrecy was. He worried constantly about being discovered, not out of guilt, but out of fear that losing his routines would mean returning to the chaotic life he had always struggled to navigate. His emotional world had shrunk to a small set of habits that provided structure where he felt none. He viewed the apartment as the one place where he couldn't be abandoned, rejected, or humiliated. It was the only environment he could fully control, and the only place where he felt shielded from the failures and disappointments that had shaped so much of his life. The apartment became a psychological fortress, a place insulated from the unpredictability of the outside world. Each time he returned home, closing the door behind him, he felt the relief of slipping back into his only sense of stability. But that stability was built on a foundation of secrecy that grew heavier with each passing month. The emotional cost of maintaining the facade began to wear on him, even though he never expressed it openly. He drank more heavily, often from the moment he woke up until he passed out late at night. His memory became patchy. His grip on time loosened. He started missing appointments, forgetting conversations, losing track of days. Yet he never lost his ability to smile softly when speaking to neighbors, or to keep his voice steady when talking to store clerks. His public self remained intact because it had been practiced for so long, shaped by years of hiding his internal struggles from the world. But inside apartment 213, he existed in a state of quiet emotional collapse, a man living entirely in the shadows of his own mind. Milwaukee, meanwhile, remained painfully unaware of what was happening within those walls. The disappearances continued at a pace that should have stirred citywide alarm, but the information never converged in a way that revealed the full picture. Departments did not share data effectively. Officers changed shifts, cases were reassigned, and missing person reports collected dust in overfilled filing cabinets. Many victims came from marginalized communities, young men whose families had limited resources, whose voices were often overlooked, whose missing persons cases did not receive the urgency they deserved. The city was not indifferent, it was simply fractured. And in that fracture, Jeffrey's world remained undisturbed. Even those closest to the disappearances struggled to find answers. Families filed reports, made phone calls, and searched neighborhood streets with growing desperation, but they often encountered only dead ends and vague reassurances. Some were told their loved ones had probably left the city voluntarily. Others were told to wait a few more days, to give it time, to trust that adults sometimes wander off. These responses deepened the grief and confusion families already carried, leaving them feeling invisible in a system struggling to connect the threads of a much larger story. Back inside apartment 213, Jeffrey's rituals continued uninterrupted as the months passed. His compulsive routines and emotional detachment grew stronger, shaping the apartment into a world that obeyed his internal logic rather than the outside world's expectations. Every object had a place. Every task had a sequence. Every moment unfolded in a way that quieted the constant emotional noise inside him. And though he felt increasingly overwhelmed by loneliness, he also feared losing the fragile sense of control his routines provided. This paradox, craving connection yet fearing vulnerability, wanting stability yet living in secrecy, kept him locked in a psychological loop he could no longer escape. By the early 1990s, the Oxford apartments had become a place where residents whispered about strange smells, odd noises, and unsettling encounters. Some avoided the second floor altogether. Others began requesting transfers to different buildings. But none of them understood the truth that lay only a few feet away, behind a door that looked no different from any other. And Jeffrey, moving through the hallways with quiet steps and downcast eyes, continued existing as both a neighbor and a mystery, someone no one questioned deeply enough, someone no one saw clearly enough, someone whose loneliness had grown into something far larger than the city could possibly imagine. The apartment had become his entire world. A world built from secrecy. A world held together by silence. A world that was beginning to crack. Chapter 9, Investigation and Suspicion, Red Flags Ignored. As the early 1990s unfolded, Milwaukee's police force found itself caught between rising crime rates, limited manpower, and a growing number of missing person reports that seemed to drift endlessly through the system without resolution. Officers filed paperwork, conducted interviews, and followed leads that often evaporated as quickly as they appeared. But the city was not yet ready to see the pattern forming beneath the surface, a pattern that connected neighborhoods, communities, and young men who vanished without leaving a trace. Each case existed in isolation, handled by different departments, different detectives, and different levels of urgency. Some families insisted that something was terribly wrong, that their sons would never simply disappear, but their fears were too often met with polite reassurances or vague suggestions that the missing may have left voluntarily. And in a time when communication systems were slow, computer databases were limited, and community police relationships were strained, those reassurances became the quiet spaces where larger truths slipped through unnoticed. Behind the scenes, detectives did catch small glimpses of something unusual, though none of it yet formed a coherent picture. A young man's disappearance would include a vague description of someone he was last seen with, a quiet white male in his 20s or 30s. Another case mentioned a man offering money for photos. A third involved someone seen leaving a bar with a stranger who looked withdrawn and uncomfortable. These fragments surfaced sporadically, never landing in the same hands long enough to register as a pattern. And so the red flags collected like scattered pieces of a puzzle that no one realized needed assembling. Milwaukee was a busy city, full of noise, movement, and shifting populations, and the transient nature of many victims made these early warnings easy to overlook, easy to explain away, easy to misplace in a system that was already stretched thin. The chaos of urban life masked the silence left behind by those who vanished, and the investigation, such as it was, remained a patchwork of disconnected efforts. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Dahmer continued moving quietly through the city with the same understated presence that had shielded him for years. His outward routine remained almost painfully ordinary: work shifts when he could manage them, errand runs to corner stores, short conversations with neighbors or clerks, evenings spent drifting between bars and familiar streets. He did not draw attention, did not cause public disruptions, did not behave in a way that suggested anything unusual. When police occasionally crossed paths with him, during noise complaints, neighborhood patrols, or casual encounters, he appeared cooperative, polite, and almost shy. His soft tone and nervous smile disarmed suspicion instantly. Officers had no reason to see him as anything more than a lonely young man trying to navigate a difficult life. And Jeffrey relied on that perception, leaning into it with every careful word and every quiet gesture. Still, cracks in the facade appeared from time to time. The persistent odors from apartment 213, the heavy trash bags he disposed of at odd hours, the strange noises late at night, these details accumulated in the building's collective memory even as they failed to reach the attention of authorities. Neighbors whispered complaints to one another in hallways or outside on the sidewalk, some convinced that something was off, others attributing the oddities to mental health struggles or poorly maintained appliances. A few residents did contact the building manager, but without concrete evidence or a clear understanding of what they were witnessing, their concerns never made it further than a brief conversation or a lightly documented note. The Oxford apartments were not the kind of place where people expected swift intervention. Poverty, turnover, and general urban fatigue kept complaints contained to the building itself, never reaching a point where law enforcement would feel compelled to respond with urgency. At the same time, investigative pressure in other parts of the city was growing. Families continued searching for answers, pushing harder for updates, pressing officers for any shred of information. Flyers circulated through neighborhoods, taped to storefronts, bus stops, and laundromat walls. Community meetings filled with tense conversations about safety, missing persons, and the unease spreading through certain districts. Some young men reported encounters with a strange individual offering money for companionship or photographs, but when these stories reached police, they were often dismissed as minor incidents without clear connections to ongoing cases. Without physical evidence or consistent witness descriptions, these accounts seemed too vague to act upon, and officers, juggling heavy caseloads, were forced to prioritize what appeared to be more immediate threats. Jeffrey, watching all of this unfold around him, felt the pressure tightening in ways he could not escape. His routines had become more rigid, his dependence on alcohol deeper, and his emotional state increasingly unstable. He knew, somewhere beneath the haze of his compulsions, that the world around him was narrowing. That the secrecy he depended on was thinning. That the emotional weight he carried was no longer hidden as neatly as before. Yet he remained committed to maintaining the quiet, harmless persona that had protected him for years. He continued offering soft apologies for disturbances. He continued deflecting suspicion with gentle explanations. He continued presenting himself as someone who posed no danger, someone who barely occupied space in the world, someone so forgettable that no one thought to look at him twice. But red flags were everywhere now, small, subtle, easy to misinterpret, but unmistakable when viewed together. Neighbors reported strange smells. Families reported disappearances. Friends reported worrying last encounters. And in bars and on street corners, whispers began circulating about a man who always seemed to be alone, who always appeared lost in thought, who sometimes offered money with a tone that felt slightly off. None of these warnings were loud enough individually, but collectively they formed a chorus that the city had not yet learned to hear. The investigation remained scattered, the suspicion remained unfocused, and the apartment on North 25th Street remained a place where secrets deepened with each passing day. The story was inching closer to its breaking point, though no one, not even Jeffrey, understood just how close it had become. As the tension quietly swelled beneath Milwaukee's surface, the red flags that had accumulated over months, and in some cases years, remained scattered across the city, unconnected pieces in an investigation that had not yet taken shape. Families, still searching for answers, found themselves moving through a maze of unreturned calls, unanswered questions, and case files that shifted hands too often to gain traction. Some relatives reported sightings that led nowhere. Others described last phone calls or strange encounters that officers documented but did not link to anything broader. The city's communication networks, strained by outdated systems and limited resources, struggled to track missing adults whose cases crossed multiple jurisdictions. And because so many of the young men who vanished were transient or disconnected from their families for periods of time, the urgency surrounding their cases often diminished before any real progress could be made. These systemic gaps widened the quiet space in which Jeffrey Dahmer operated, an invisible corridor between isolated warnings and overlooked evidence, a place where his patterns remained hidden because no one could yet see the threads connecting them. As more disappearances surfaced, a quiet sense of unease began spreading through certain parts of Milwaukee's LGBTQ+ community, where people started sharing stories about strange interactions at bars, clubs, and bus stops. Some individuals spoke about a soft-spoken man who seemed lonely but unsettling. Others mentioned being offered money for photographs or companionship. A few recalled feeling uncomfortable as soon as they entered conversation with him, noting a strange emptiness in his eyes or an air of desperation that didn't feel quite right. These accounts circulated in whispered conversations, often dismissed as the typical unpredictability of nightlife, but still leaving a lingering impression among those who crossed paths with him. And because the community had historically faced mistrust and neglect from law enforcement, many did not feel comfortable approaching police with their concerns, choosing instead to quietly warn one another. This unspoken network of caution was strong within the community but invisible to investigators who could have recognized the danger in those stories if they had been shared. At the same time, Jeffrey's world was becoming increasingly unstable. His drinking escalated to the point where whole days blurred together, and he often moved through Milwaukee in a fog that dulled his awareness of how close his life was to collapsing. He became more careless, more visibly unsteady in public, yet somehow still capable of slipping back behind the quiet, polite demeanor that had shielded him for so long. His appearance grew more disheveled, but not enough to raise alarm among those who saw him only in passing. In a city where countless people struggled with addiction, unemployment, or mental health challenges, Jeffrey looked like just one more lost soul trying to stay afloat. Even when neighbors saw him stumbling through the hallway or speaking in a slurred, distracted tone, they chalked it up to personal troubles rather than the possibility of something far more disturbing. The Oxford Apartments, after all, housed many residents who battled their own demons, and Jeffrey simply blended into that landscape of hardship and quiet suffering. Inside his apartment, however, the emotional and psychological strain was reaching a breaking point. Jeffrey lived in a constant tug-of-war between the desire for control and the fear of being discovered, between the need for companionship and the terror of abandonment. His routines, once rigid but manageable, became increasingly frantic and disorganized. He lost track of time more frequently. His drinking intensified. He struggled to maintain the careful structure he had built around his life, and each misstep pushed him closer to the edge of exposure. There were moments when he sensed the inevitability of his situation, when he realized that the fragile world he had created inside apartment 213 could not hold forever. But he remained trapped by his compulsions, unable to pull himself out of the emotional spiral that had consumed him since adolescence. He understood, on some level, that the walls were closing in, but he could not break free from the routines that anchored him to the life he had built in secret. In early 1991, tension reached a quiet but unmistakable crescendo. More families came forward, determined to push past bureaucratic barriers to demand answers about their missing sons. Some returned to the same police stations they'd visited months earlier, refusing to let their loved ones be forgotten. Others formed small community groups to share information, hoping that collective effort might succeed where individual attempts had failed. And as these families continued searching, their voices grew louder, not in anger, but in desperation. They were no longer content with vague explanations or assurances that cases would be reviewed. They wanted answers. They wanted progress. They wanted someone to take the disappearances seriously. This growing pressure forced small cracks in the investigative silence, prompting a few detectives to revisit old case files, re-examine missing persons reports, and look for any thread of connection that had been overlooked. Yet even as pressure mounted, Jeffrey moved through the city with the same quiet steps, unaware that he was being nudged closer to discovery by forces he could not see. He still visited bars, still offered soft smiles to neighbors, still drifted through routines that now held more anxiety than comfort. His emotional detachment had reached a point where the outside world felt distant and unreal, a blur of noises and faces he could barely process. And although he sensed the growing instability of his life, he continued clinging to the belief that if he maintained calm on the surface, if he apologized politely, kept to himself, and avoided drawing attention, he could preserve the increasingly fragile world he had constructed inside apartment 213. But fate was already shifting. The scattered red flags that had gone unnoticed for years were beginning, slowly, to move toward each other. Families were talking. Neighbors were whispering. Detectives were reviewing cases. And deep within the growing tension, the city of Milwaukee stood on the brink of discovering the truth behind the disappearances that had haunted it for so long. The silence that had protected Jeffrey Dahmer for over a decade was thinning, and the weight of the secrets he carried was becoming too heavy for his carefully crafted facade to hold. Soon, the investigation would finally find its direction. Soon, the red flags would no longer be ignored. And soon, apartment 213 would no longer be a secret world hidden behind a locked door. Chapter 10, The Investigation Tightens, Detectives on the Hunt. As 1991 unfolded, the atmosphere in Milwaukee began to shift, not with sudden panic, but with a slow, steady tension that tightened like a rope drawn quietly through unseen hands. Detectives who had grown accustomed to the city's constant flow of cases now found certain disappearances resurfacing in unexpected ways. Reports that once felt unrelated began overlapping through names, locations, patterns, and timelines. A detective reviewing an old file would notice a detail that matched something he heard in a briefing. Another would come across a name already scribbled in the margins of a different case. These were not yet the flashing signs of a single suspect, but they were enough to stir a sense of unease among investigators who understood what it meant when coincidences began repeating themselves. A few officers started to feel as though something was weaving through the city's missing person records, a thread faint enough to miss at first glance, but persistent enough to tug at the edge of their attention. And as they compared notes informally, talked over coffee, or revisited cases they hadn't looked at in months, the same realization slowly echoed. Through the department, too many young men were vanishing without explanation, and no one could say why. Families, desperate for answers, continued to push investigators for progress. Some came to police stations in person, clutching photos, letters, or belongings that once belonged to their missing sons. Others called regularly, politely at first, then with growing urgency, their voices carrying the exhaustion of long nights spent waiting by phones that never rang. These families weren't asking for miracles, they were asking for movement. And their insistence forced detectives to re-examine cases that had long been buried under stacks of new reports. Officers began to see similarities they had overlooked before, shared physical characteristics, last known locations near the same bars, sightings of young men entering cars with quiet strangers. But the clues were still too thin, too spread out, too fragmented to form a clear target. In a city of 500,000 people, the idea of one offender quietly moving through the community seemed almost impossible. And yet, the silence surrounding the disappearances felt too heavy to ignore. Meanwhile, in the local LGBTQ+ community, the whispers grew louder. Bartenders spoke about regulars who suddenly stopped showing up. Friends noticed familiar faces missing from street corners and clubs. Some recalled conversations with a man who seemed lonely, awkward, and quietly intense, a man who sometimes offered money for companionship or photographs. His appearance was unremarkable, his voice soft and unsure, his demeanor almost forgettable. But something about him left people uneasy in a way they couldn't quite put into words. These whispers rarely reached law enforcement, partly out of distrust and partly out of fear that no one would take the stories seriously. Yet these quiet warnings formed an invisible map of red flags that detectives might have connected sooner if the lines of communication had been stronger. As it was, the stories stayed within the community, circulating like signals no one knew how to interpret. And while all of this unfolded, Jeffrey Dahmer continued his routine with the same subdued presence that had shielded him for years. He walked slowly, spoke softly, kept his head down, and moved through Milwaukee as though trying to slip between the cracks of the city. His emotional world was unraveling, but outwardly he appeared almost painfully ordinary. He still visited the same bars. He still rode the same buses. He still stopped by the same corner stores. The people who saw him regularly barely noticed him beyond a nod or a passing glance. Even those who felt uneasy around him could never pinpoint why. He simply seemed like someone struggling quietly with loneliness or addiction, not someone capable of anything extreme. That blend of awkwardness and politeness made him nearly invisible, even as the disappearances continued. Inside the police department, a small number of detectives began privately sharing their concerns. They didn't have evidence of a single suspect yet, not even close, but they agreed that too many cases were piling up without explanation. They reviewed missing person files late at night, tracing circles around dates, locations, and witness statements. Some detectives visited streets where individuals were last seen, hoping to spark a new lead. Others contacted families again, gathering details that hadn't seemed important months earlier. Little by little, vague patterns began to emerge, though they remained fragile and easily dismissed. The missing young men shared similar ages and backgrounds, often disappearing near the same cluster of bars or bus routes. Most were last seen with someone described only as a quiet guy, a white male, soft-spoken, awkward, lonely, or a man who offered money. These descriptions were too broad to narrow down a suspect, yet too consistent to ignore entirely. Jeffrey's behavior outside his apartment began attracting slightly more attention, not suspicion, but curiosity. Bartenders noticed him drinking more heavily, sometimes sitting alone for hours with a faraway look in his eyes. A shop clerk mentioned he seemed tense and distracted. A neighbor recalled hearing him pacing at odd hours, footsteps moving back and forth like someone unable to settle. None of these observations were alarming on their own, but they revealed pieces of a man whose internal world was slipping. Jeffrey sensed it too. He felt the pressure rising around him, the unease of a life built on secrecy weakening beneath the weight of his own instability. But he clung to the quiet mask he had worn since adolescence, believing that as long as he remained polite, calm, and unremarkable, he could continue drifting unnoticed through the city. Yet fate was moving, slowly but irrevocably. Investigators were beginning to see patterns. Families were refusing to be silenced. Communities were growing anxious. And Jeffrey himself, fraying under the strain of alcohol and deteriorating routine, was becoming less careful than he once had been. These converging forces formed the early outline of a breakthrough, still faint, still vulnerable to collapse, but unmistakably present. Something was shifting in Milwaukee. The silence that had protected Jeffrey Dahmer for so long had begun to crack, and the first threads of an answer were tightening around a truth the city had avoided for years. The search was no longer scattered. The pressure was building. The investigation was finally, slowly, turning toward apartment 213. As detectives continued comparing notes and re-examining case files, the growing sense that something larger was at play began spreading through the department, quietly at first, like a rumor whispered between officers who had seen too much to trust coincidence. The information remained incomplete, but the similarities were impossible to ignore: the ages of the missing men, the bars they frequented, the times of night they disappeared, the eerie consistency in witness descriptions of the last person they were seen with. The pieces did not yet form a clear picture, but they formed a direction, something rare in cases that had long felt stagnant and scattered. Detectives began dedicating more time to these threads, revisiting neighborhoods, speaking with community members, and gathering details that had once seemed unimportant. Each new conversation revealed something small: a tone someone remembered, a detail someone had dismissed, a description someone had never reported before, and though none of it directly identified a suspect, it built momentum that had been missing for years. The cases no longer felt like isolated tragedies, they felt connected, as though someone had been moving quietly through Milwaukee, unseen and unrecognized. In community spaces, the growing fear became more visible. People began traveling in pairs, watching each other more closely, checking in on friends who walked home alone. Bartenders leaned over counters to share warnings with patrons. Flyers for missing young men multiplied on bulletin boards, their faces creating a haunting collage of unanswered questions. At bus stops, street corners, and club entrances, small conversations took place between strangers who shared the same lingering worry, that someone was out there, someone who blended into the night and chose people who would not be missed quickly enough. These conversations rarely reached police headquarters directly, but they created an atmosphere detectives could feel when they visited the areas most affected. A tension hung in the air, quiet but unmistakable, as though the city itself sensed something dangerous lurking beneath its ordinary surface. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Dahmer moved through this rising anxiety with a fragile calm, unaware that the investigation was inching closer to him with each passing week. His emotional and psychological state continued to deteriorate, leaving him increasingly dependent on alcohol and increasingly disconnected from reality. His routines, once carefully maintained, became inconsistent and frantic. He sometimes stayed inside for days, pacing from room to room, unable to settle, unable to focus, drifting in and out of restless sleep. Other times he wandered the streets for hours, appearing dazed and unfocused, walking with the slow, lost movements of someone trying to outrun a storm only he could feel. His apartment grew more chaotic, his thoughts more tangled, and his ability to maintain the mask of normalcy weaker with every passing day. Yet even in this fragile state, he continued interacting with people in the same polite, soft-spoken manner that had always made him appear harmless. But now, cracks formed where cracks had never appeared before. Neighbors began noticing his behavior more sharply, how his expression seemed vacant, how the smell near his door seemed stronger, how his movements appeared more erratic. Some felt uneasy walking past his apartment. Others wondered if something was wrong with him, though they could not imagine the truth behind that door. Complaints to the building manager increased, though without any concrete evidence, nothing changed. The Oxford Apartments remained a place where people endured strange behavior without expecting intervention. Even when the building manager visited Jeffrey, he met the same soft apologies and quiet reassurances that had diffused suspicion so many times before. The mask still worked, though barely. By the middle of 1991, detectives began hearing scattered mentions of a soft-spoken man who frequented certain bars, always alone, always watching, always offering something that made people uneasy. These accounts were vague, but they added to the growing sense that the disappearances might be connected to a single individual. Some officers began patrolling certain neighborhoods more frequently, lingering near bars and club entrances in hopes of catching something unusual. Others conducted informal interviews with bartenders, bouncers, and regular patrons. Small but telling details emerged. A man who matched earlier descriptions often left bars with young men who were never seen again. No one knew his name. No one knew where he lived. But his presence lingered in conversations like a quiet warning. Despite this progress, the investigation still moved slowly, hindered by the lack of concrete evidence, inconsistent witness statements, and the transient nature of many victims. Investigators knew they were missing something critical, some link, some moment, some detail that would tie everything together. They could feel the presence of the person responsible, like a shadow that moved just beyond their line of sight, but they could not yet identify him. And while detectives worked late into the night, combing through files under fluorescent lights, Jeffrey continued living in apartment 213, drifting through his unraveling routines with the growing sense that time was running out. The city itself seemed to sense that something was approaching, a moment where silence would break and truth would surface. The tension grew heavier in the neighborhoods most affected by the disappearances. People watched strangers more closely. Parents warned their sons to stay alert. Community members shared every rumor, every suspicion, every uneasy encounter. Even those who knew nothing about the investigation felt the shift, felt the weight settling over Milwaukee like an unseen storm cloud. And all the while, the police department continued inching toward a breakthrough. Detectives reviewed missing person files side by side. They marked maps with pins indicating the last known locations of each victim. They re-interviewed witnesses whose memories had faded, hoping for a detail they might have overlooked before. The pieces were still scattered, but they were finally moving toward a shape, an outline that pointed not to chance or coincidence, but to a single individual who had built his life on secrecy, invisibility, and patterns only now coming into view. By midsummer, the tension reached its peak. The investigation, once directionless, now had momentum. The families, once dismissed, were finally being heard. The whispers, once confined to community spaces, were making their way into police reports. Milwaukee did not yet know the name Jeffrey Dahmer, but the city was closer than ever to learning it. The silence was thinning. The mask was slipping. And the storm that had been building behind the door of apartment 213 was about to break in a way no one could have anticipated. Soon, the search would end. Soon, the truth would surface. And soon, the quiet man no one suspected would face the moment he had been avoiding for years. Chapter 11, The Long Sleep, Years of Silence and Waiting. As the late 1980s shifted into the early months of 1991, Milwaukee found itself in a strange period of uneasy quiet, a lull that felt less like peace and more like the breath held between two storms. The disappearances had slowed, at least on the surface, creating an illusion that the danger had passed or that the worst was behind the city. Families of missing sons continued searching, but even their most determined efforts seemed to hit the same unyielding walls: no leads, no sightings, no clues that pointed to anything beyond the painful silence that had followed them for years. Some parents sat by windows night after night, listening for footsteps that never came. Others kept bedrooms intact, clothes folded neatly, pictures arranged in perfect order, as though maintaining the space might somehow pull their loved ones home. Letters went unanswered. Phone calls rang into empty voids. And the city, unable to understand the magnitude of what it was facing, settled into a weary stillness marked by quiet anxiety rather than the urgency the situation deserved. It was as though the entire community had fallen into a long sleep, suspended in a haze of denial, grief, exhaustion, and the faint, fading hope that missing young men might simply walk through their front doors again one day. For law enforcement, this period of stillness became its own kind of trap. With fewer new reports surfacing and many old cases stalled, detectives found themselves drifting between cold files and fresh responsibilities, always torn between past obligations and present demands. Some officers believed the disappearances had slowed because whatever danger once existed had passed. Others suspected that the lull was deceptive, that someone was simply becoming more careful. Yet without new evidence, without fresh leads, and without a clear suspect, the cases remained suspended in time, frozen in a state where questions multiplied but answers remained unreachable. Investigators returned to old notes, revisited missing person reports, and combed through interviews that offered glimpses of potential, but nothing definitive. They were caught in a cycle of waiting, unsure whether the silence was a sign that the threat had ended or that it was simply lying dormant, waiting for an opportunity to re-emerge. Inside apartment 213, that dormancy took on a different form entirely. Jeffrey Dahmer moved through his routines with an eerie,
repetitive consistency, drifting between long stretches of isolation and brief, disoriented attempts to engage with the world outside. He would leave his apartment for short periods, walking slowly, expression distant, steps unsteady from drinking, but always returned as though compelled by an invisible tether pulling him back to the only environment where he felt any sense of control. The quiet periods in his life were not filled with calm, they were filled with an emotional fog that made time feel thick and distorted. Days bled into nights, nights into mornings, without the clear separation most people rely on to stay grounded. His apartment grew increasingly unkempt, his habits increasingly unpredictable. Even the simplest tasks, washing dishes, taking out trash, organizing belongings, became overwhelming barriers he often stepped around rather than addressed. Jeffrey existed in a strange, stagnant rhythm that felt less like daily life and more like drifting through a deep, internal sleep he could not fully wake from. Yet despite this emotional disarray, he remained outwardly composed enough to conceal his turmoil from those who passed him in hallways, stores, or on the street. His neighbors, already accustomed to unusual behavior in the building, saw him as eccentric but not alarming. Some whispered that he seemed lonely, others suspected substance issues, while a few simply avoided him altogether without knowing why. But none of them imagined the scale of what was happening in his private world. The long sleep of these years created a strange barrier, one where Jeffrey's increasingly unstable behavior didn't raise alarm because it was overshadowed by the quiet monotony of everyday apartment life. The silence that surrounded him insulated him, giving him space to unravel without attracting attention. This period of dormancy, both in the investigation and in Jeffrey's personal life, became a turning point that almost no one recognized at the time. It was a pause that stretched like a shadow across Milwaukee, a moment when danger felt distant, when the city's collective guard lowered, when the urgency of earlier disappearances softened into something that felt like tragic coincidence rather than a pattern. In that lull, Jeffrey's world grew more fragile, his routines more erratic, his internal conflict more difficult to manage. The cracks in his calm exterior widened. He was drinking heavily, losing weight, sleeping sporadically, and drifting in and out of emotional dissociation. And while the world around him remained unaware, inside apartment 213, the pressure that had been building for years grew heavier, more unstable, more likely to collapse with even the slightest shift. The long sleep also created a false sense of safety among detectives who, despite lingering doubts, had little evidence to suggest a serial offender was active in the city. Without new disappearances, it became easy for officials to shift focus toward other crimes demanding immediate attention. Case files slipped deeper into drawers. Names faded from public memory. News reports shifted to new topics. And the families who continued searching found themselves fighting to keep their loved ones' stories from disappearing into silence. The lull created distance, not only between investigators and victims, but between the truth and the possibility of uncovering it. The longer the quiet stretched, the harder it became to reignite urgency. It was a sleep that dulled instincts, softened suspicion, and allowed the threads of the investigation to loosen again. But underneath this stillness, movement was beginning. Not loud movement, not the dramatic breakthroughs seen in movies or documentaries, but small, subtle shifts that would eventually change everything. Conversation among officers grew slightly sharper. Notes that once felt irrelevant began to stand out. Reports that had sat untouched for months resurfaced on desks. Families continued calling, writing, visiting stations, refusing to let their pain be forgotten. And Jeffrey, drifting deeper into emotional instability, began losing the tight grip he had once maintained on his secrecy. Without realizing it, he was stepping toward a moment where the long sleep that had protected him, and concealed the truth for so long, would finally end. The city did not know it yet, but the quiet was almost over. The stillness was beginning to crack. And Milwaukee was on the edge of waking up. And as Milwaukee drifted deeper into this uneasy calm, Jeffrey Dahmer's life entered a phase that was at once strangely quiet and profoundly unstable, a period marked by long stretches of emotional numbness that pulled him further from reality. He spent more time alone than ever before, often sitting in silence for hours with the television flickering in the background, the noise barely registering in his mind. He wandered the apartment with slow, distracted movements, pacing between the living room and the bedroom, sometimes collapsing into restless sleep, sometimes staying awake through entire nights without realizing it. His drinking intensified to the point where alcohol became his primary anchor, the only thing that dulled the pounding pressure of isolation and the chaotic thoughts that spun endlessly beneath the surface. He drank to forget, to quiet his anxiety, to flatten the emotions he could no longer manage. But the more he tried to silence his mind, the more detached he became from the outside world, creating a widening gap between the life he showed others and the turmoil he carried alone. His apartment reflected this internal decline, cluttered, dim, stagnant, filled with an atmosphere that felt heavy and unmoving, as though the air itself had grown tired of the routine. Even in this state, Jeffrey maintained a fragile version of the polite persona he had cultivated for years. When he ventured outside, usually in the late hours of evening, when the streets were quieter, he kept his voice soft, his gestures small, his expression subdued. Clerks, bartenders, and neighbors continued seeing him as quiet, awkward, or troubled, but not threatening. His detached demeanor gave people the impression of someone who had simply fallen on hard times, someone trying to handle personal struggles without asking for help. This perception protected him in ways that even he did not fully understand. It allowed him to drift through public spaces unnoticed, his presence as unremarkable as a shadow cast by a passing car. But beneath that mild exterior, the emotional storm he had fought for years was becoming harder to hide, harder to manage, and harder to control. The long sleep in Milwaukee's investigation coincided perfectly with Jeffrey's unraveling, creating an overlap that prevented the truth from surfacing sooner. Officers who might have otherwise pushed for deeper inquiry found themselves overwhelmed by new cases, budget constraints, and shifting priorities. With no new disappearances reported that clearly matched the earlier patterns, the sense of urgency dissipated. The city's attention drifted toward other issues: violence in certain neighborhoods, drug activity, economic pressures, and political debates. The missing young men, once discussed frequently, faded into the background of public consciousness. And because many of the victims came from marginalized communities whose voices were rarely amplified by the media, the lull in reporting only deepened the silence. Yet beneath this silence, the investigation had not died, it had merely slowed. A few detectives continued quietly reviewing old files, unable to shake the feeling that something had been missed. They saw the patterns others overlooked and held scattered memories of conversations that had never been fully connected. These detectives harbored a persistent intuition, the kind that kept them awake at night, flipping through documents or replaying witness statements in their minds. They couldn't articulate exactly what felt wrong, but they sensed an unfinished story lingering behind unanswered questions. And though they lacked the evidence needed to press forward, their instinct remained steady. The disappearances were not accidents, not coincidence, not the random drift of young men through a troubled city. Something darker tied them together. Meanwhile, within the LGBTQ+ community, whispers continued circulating. People remembered the last time they'd seen certain friends, replaying interactions that had once seemed insignificant. They recalled the awkward man who appeared at bars, sometimes offering money, sometimes asking for company, always seeming somehow out of place. These stories carried a quiet urgency, shared in conversations held in corners of clubs, over smoked cigarettes outside doorways, or during late-night confessions between friends. If the police had been able to gather these accounts, if the system had encouraged trust between community members and investigators, the puzzle pieces might have aligned sooner. But decades of strained relationships meant many people didn't feel safe approaching law enforcement with their concerns, choosing instead to warn one another privately while hoping the danger would somehow pass. As this long sleep stretched on, Jeffrey sensed the internal collapse gaining momentum. He tried to re-establish routines, to regain the fragile sense of stability he once felt inside his apartment, but each attempt fell apart almost as soon as it began. He lost track of time more frequently. He misplaced objects more often. His dreams grew more disjointed, his waking thoughts more clouded. There were moments when he felt the weight of his actions pressing against him, moments when he recognized the impossibility of continuing the life he lived. But rather than confront these thoughts, he retreated further into the emotional fog that alcohol provided. The more he drank, the quieter the internal noise became, and the quieter the noise became, the deeper he sank into routine. It was a cycle he could not break, a cycle that lulled him deeper into detachment even as his life moved closer to its breaking point. By the middle of 1991, the silence became too heavy to maintain. Small cracks appeared across the city's collective calm, new stories, new concerns, new questions, each one pushing Milwaukee a little closer to waking from the long sleep. Detectives began connecting notes with more urgency. Families became more vocal. Community whispers grew louder. And Jeffrey, unraveling beneath the weight of his secrets, found his routine slipping out of his control. The quiet that had protected him for nearly a decade was thinning, losing its strength, losing its stability. Soon, the lull would end. Soon, the period of waiting would break open. And soon, the truth behind apartment 213 would finally come into the light the city had avoided for far too long. Chapter 12, Neighbors and Community, Unseen Warnings. In the early months of 1991, the Oxford apartments on North 25th Street carried a strange quiet, a mix of ordinary apartment noise and an undercurrent of tension that only a few residents could sense. The building wasn't luxurious, but it was alive with its own ecosystem, families arguing across thin walls, radios playing softly through the evenings, footsteps echoing in hallways, and the constant hum of everyday life that stitched neighbors together. And yet, within this patchwork of voices and routines, there was one unit that stood apart, not because of loud disturbances, but because of a persistent, unexplainable discomfort that hovered around it. Apartment 213. Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. People didn't always know why they felt uneasy, but they felt it, something subtle, something off, something that pressed faintly at the edges of their instincts without ever revealing itself clearly. For many residents, their lives were already difficult enough, filled with financial stress, childcare challenges, or long work shifts, so they didn't have energy to investigate a bad feeling. But that unease lingered all the same. Some neighbors described Jeffrey as shy and soft-spoken, a young man who kept to himself and rarely caused trouble. He offered polite nods, short answers, and avoided conflict whenever possible. He wasn't threatening in appearance, in fact, his quietness often read as sadness or loneliness rather than danger. But beneath these small interactions, there were warning signs, subtle, easy to miss individually, but deeply unsettling when viewed together. Strange smells drifting from Unit 213, odors that would come and go unpredictably, sometimes sharp enough to push through closed doors and drift down hallways. Loud humming or mechanical sounds at odd hours of the night. The thump of something heavy being moved across a floor. A sudden clatter followed by total silence. And now and then, faint voices or murmurs that didn't sound like a TV or radio. These moments created ripples of concern through the building, but because they were inconsistent and Jeffrey always had calm explanations ready, spoiled meat, broken appliances, tropical fish dying in his tank, the complaints never grew into action, and the unease never grew into certainty. Still, for those who lived closest to him, the discomfort deepened over time. One neighbor, who had children, often expressed fear about letting them walk near Jeffrey's door. She couldn't articulate what frightened her, she simply knew something didn't feel right. Another resident, who worked late-night shifts, often passed Jeffrey in the hallway when he returned home. He described Jeffrey as polite but distant, with a blankness in his eyes that made every interaction feel strangely hollow. A few people heard what they thought were muffled arguments or pained sounds coming from inside the apartment, but because they could never confirm what they heard, and because the building often carried echoes that distorted noise, no one felt confident enough to call police. Most of the community operated under a heavy mix of caution, exhaustion, and mistrust. Many of the residents, particularly black residents who had experienced discrimination or dismissal from law enforcement, felt hesitant to get authorities involved unless they had undeniable proof. In their experience, vague suspicion rarely led to action. And then there were the moments that nearly changed everything, brief encounters where opportunity brushed against intervention but slipped away each time. There were times when young men were seen entering Jeffrey's apartment late at night, sometimes appearing intoxicated or unsteady, sometimes looking nervous. But because the building housed many people with active social lives, these comings and goings didn't raise immediate alarms. There was a moment when one resident claimed she heard something heavy drop, followed by a strange dragging sound, but she convinced herself it was furniture. Another neighbor complained about the smell for the third time, and although maintenance visited, Jeffrey's explanations, mixed with his polite, quiet demeanor, diffused the situation before it sparked real investigation. It wasn't neglect so much as a complicated intersection of poverty, overworked staff, systemic mistrust, and the quiet simplicity of Jeffrey's outward behavior. His stillness disarmed people. His politeness softened suspicion. And his ordinary appearance dissolved fear. Yet despite his calm mask, the tension surrounding Jeffrey's apartment grew heavier, like a subtle pressure building in the air. Even casual passers-by noticed something unsettling. Something about the dimness of the lights inside Unit 213, or the way Jeffrey stood in his doorway as though guarding the threshold, speaking quietly but never stepping fully into the hall. There was an emotional coldness in the way he held himself, an absence of warmth that made some neighbors instinctively keep their distance. Children avoided the door without being told. Adults exchanged looks of mutual concern they didn't know how to voice. And slowly, the building developed an unspoken rule: avoid apartment 213 unless you absolutely have to. Meanwhile, Jeffrey continued moving through daily life with a strange, ritualized monotony. He went to work, returned home, carried bottles of alcohol into his apartment, and isolated himself for long stretches of time. He offered small talk when necessary, but his conversations were brief and often scattered, another sign that something was wrong, though not enough to reveal the truth. This isolation allowed his internal world to tighten around him like a cocoon, creating a dangerous loop where fear, compulsion, loneliness, and addiction all swirled together without interruption. His mind drifted, his focus slipped, and his emotional detachment deepened. The warning signs were there, visible to anyone who looked closely, but no one felt empowered or safe enough to act boldly on their instincts. By late spring of 1991, the weight of these warnings hovered thickly over the building. Neighbors continued exchanging small comments, questions without answers, concerns without direction. Some wondered aloud if Jeffrey needed help. Others wondered if he was dangerous. And though no one could prove anything, nearly everyone near apartment 213 felt the same quiet pressure building inside them: something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time. And whatever it was getting harder to ignore. The long sleep of the city had not lifted yet, but inside the Oxford apartments, people were beginning to stir, beginning to sense that the silence surrounding Jeffrey Dahmer was not just strange, but deeply unsafe. As the months pressed deeper into 1991, the discomfort surrounding Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment grew into something thicker, something that settled into the walls and floors of the Oxford apartments like moisture. The residents, already balancing the difficulties of low-income housing and the daily grind of survival, found themselves increasingly alert whenever they passed his door. They didn't have solid evidence, nothing concrete they could point to, but they felt the weight of 100 tiny moments that didn't add up. They remembered the sour odor that drifted from beneath his door in unpredictable waves. They remembered the odd timing of noises from his apartment, sounds that emerged when the rest of the building slept. They remembered the young men who came and went at strange hours, their faces tight with discomfort or confusion. They remembered the glassy look in Jeffrey's eyes when he returned from nights of heavy drinking, drifting through hallways like someone half awake. These memories collected in their minds like scattered puzzle pieces, pieces that didn't reveal the full picture but suggested something far more troubling than ordinary apartment life. One of the clearest warnings came from a neighbor who shared a wall with Jeffrey. She complained repeatedly about the smell, an odor so strong at times that she burned incense, left windows open in winter, and scrubbed her apartment with cleaning products to escape it. Each time she approached Jeffrey, he responded in the same soft, calm voice, apologizing and explaining that his freezer had broken again, or that his tropical fish had died, or that he was storing old meat that needed to be thrown out. His voice never wavered, never rose above gentle politeness, and that consistency disarmed suspicion just enough to stop the complaints from reaching the level of formal reports. The neighbor didn't believe him. She said as much to friends and family, but she didn't know what else to do. In a building where tenants faced eviction for the smallest disturbances, pushing too hard felt dangerous. So she returned to her routines, carrying the dread with her, hoping the smell would eventually fade. It never did. Other residents had encounters that lingered in their memories long after they walked away. One man recalled seeing Jeffrey carrying a large blue barrel into the apartment, straining under its weight, his face tight with effort. When the man offered help, Jeffrey declined sharply, more sharply than his usual demeanor, before softening his tone and giving a vague excuse about storing chemicals. Another neighbor remembered hearing Jeffrey speaking to someone in his apartment, only to realize moments later that she heard no second voice responding. She dismissed it at the time, chalking it up to television or stress, but the moment stayed with her, resurfacing weeks later when she passed his door and felt a sudden chill run through her body. Even the building manager, who occasionally entered Jeffrey's unit for maintenance checks, felt something unsettling about the space. He noticed the clutter, the heavy air, and Jeffrey's nervousness whenever anyone stepped too close to certain areas of the apartment. But because Jeffrey paid rent on time, didn't cause disruptive noise, and offered calm explanations for everything, the manager filed away his unease as another passing instinct. Meanwhile, Jeffrey's interactions with the residents grew increasingly strained. He avoided eye contact more often, shut conversations down quickly, and seemed to drift through shared spaces in a haze of detachment. His movements became rigid, his responses short, his presence almost ghost-like. Alcohol clung to him at all hours, each drink pulling him further into isolation. Even when people felt compassion for him, seeing him as a lonely, troubled young man, they sensed a disconnect, a hollowness in his behavior that made him difficult to reach. He wasn't just withdrawn, he was absent, emotionally and mentally. And that absence created a boundary no one could cross, even if they tried. He existed beside his neighbors but not with them, a man living next door yet entirely removed from the life of the building. Despite all this, no single moment pushed anyone to call the police with urgency, until the night of May 27, 1991. That night, a neighbor saw a young, dazed boy running down the street, naked, confused, and bleeding. She immediately called emergency services. When officers arrived, Jeffrey appeared seconds later, calm as always, soft-spoken, steady, claiming the boy was his partner and had simply had too much to drink. His voice was smooth, his demeanor controlled. But the neighbor was not convinced. She protested, begged the officers to investigate, insisted something was terribly wrong. Other residents joined in, shouting concerns from their windows and doorways, insisting the police listen to the fear they had carried for months. But in one of the most tragic failures of the case, the officers accepted Jeffrey's explanation, guided the boy back into apartment 213, and returned to their patrol car. The residents watched helplessly, devastated and enraged. Their instincts had screamed at them that something was wrong, and they had tried harder than ever before, to intervene. But their voices, shaped by a lifetime of being dismissed, were once again overlooked. The warnings they had seen, heard, and felt for so long were not enough to break through systemic biases or convince authorities that something much darker lurked behind Jeffrey's polite smile. In the days following that incident, the weight of failure settled heavily over the building. Residents spoke in low voices about the boy they could not protect. They watched Jeffrey with deeper suspicion, deeper fear, and deeper frustration. Every time he walked through the hall, the air seemed to tighten. Every whisper seemed to trace the outline of the unimaginable. The building felt like it was holding its breath. And beneath that suffocating quiet, something within Jeffrey shifted. His already fragile control thinned even further. His routines faltered. His drinking worsened. His isolation deepened. The cracks in his facade widened to the point where he could no longer maintain the mask he'd used for years. The neighbors didn't know it yet, but the silence that had hovered over their lives, the silence they had fought against, feared, and endured, was almost over. The long stretch of unseen warnings, the months of instinct without proof, the years of faint signals lost beneath the noise of the city, all of it was drawing to a close. Within weeks, Milwaukee would wake. The truth would surface. Apartment 213 would open. And the world would finally see what the residents had sensed all along, beneath the quiet, beneath the politeness, beneath the calmness of Jeffrey Dahmer, something horrific had been waiting to be found. Chapter 13, Capture and Confession, The End of Silence. By the summer of 1991, the quiet tension surrounding the Oxford apartments had reached a breaking point, even if the residents couldn't yet name the force pressing in on them. Something in the air felt different, heavier, sharper, the way the atmosphere shifts before a storm. People were restless. Conversations in hallways lingered longer. Strangers exchanged glances of recognition, acknowledging that the unease they had silenced for so long was becoming impossible to ignore. And meanwhile, inside apartment 213, Jeffrey Dahmer's world was collapsing from the inside out. His drinking had intensified to the point where nights blurred into mornings with no memory of how the hours passed. His thoughts drifted in erratic loops, slipping between exhaustion, panic, and a hollow detachment that made everything feel dreamlike. He moved through his routines without purpose, losing track of basic tasks, leaving plates on countertops and objects scattered in piles around the apartment. The order he once clung to, the faint sense of control that had grounded him, was disintegrating, leaving behind a fog of confusion and desperation. He felt something closing in on him, something inevitable, as though the walls he'd built around himself were finally buckling. On the night of July 22, 1991, Jeffrey walked through the humid Milwaukee streets in search of company, his emotions drifting between numbness and a rising internal pressure he couldn't fully understand. He approached strangers with a calm, soft-spoken exterior that masked the turmoil churning beneath the surface. Eventually, he met 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, a man with a quiet demeanor and a cautious, streetwise intuition. Jeffrey extended the same rehearsed invitation he had used so many times before, offering money to come back to his apartment, promising a few drinks and a place to relax. Edwards hesitated, his instincts flickering with uncertainty, but Jeffrey appeared gentle, polite, and harmless. After a moment of indecision, Edwards agreed, unaware that the entire course of the case was about to change in a way the city had been waiting for without realizing it. As they approached the Oxford apartments, Edwards felt a faint but unmistakable uneasiness settle in his chest. The building loomed quietly in the night, its lights dim, its hallways carrying the same heavy silence that had unnerved residents for years. When Jeffrey unlocked his apartment door, Edwards stepped inside and immediately sensed something was wrong. The air felt thick, stale, oppressive. There was an odor, a strange, sour smell that lingered around the edges of the room, though Jeffrey shrugged it off with a casual remark. The apartment was cluttered, dimly lit by a single lamp, with odd shadows stretching across the floor. Edwards noticed the large blue barrel in the corner, noticed how Jeffrey positioned himself between him and the exit, noticed the tension in the room that didn't match Jeffrey's soft voice. His instincts sharpened. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but he kept his expression calm, watching Jeffrey carefully as the man moved around the apartment with nervous, distracted motions. The situation escalated quickly and unpredictably. Jeffrey's behavior shifted, his tone wavering between polite conversation and sudden, unsettling commands. He attempted to restrain Edwards, but Edwards fought back, using every ounce of instinct, fear, and strength to escape. A struggle followed, brief, chaotic, fueled by adrenaline, and Edwards managed to break free, pushing past Jeffrey and sprinting out of the apartment, down the hallway, and out into the night. He ran until he found police officers on patrol, his wrist still partially restrained. Breathless and terrified, he told them what had happened, describing Jeffrey's apartment, describing what he had seen, describing the fear that had driven him to flee. The officers listened, initially expecting to handle a domestic dispute or a minor confrontation, but Edwards's intensity and urgency convinced them to investigate. When the officers arrived at apartment 213, Jeffrey answered the door with the same outward calm he had relied on for years, soft-spoken, polite, appearing confused by the commotion. He tried to smooth over the situation, offering explanations that sounded rehearsed, hoping to deflect suspicion long enough to regain control. But this time, the officers didn't simply accept his words. They stepped past him into the apartment, following the faint smell and the cluttered state of the room. One officer noticed Polaroid photographs in a drawer, images that were unmistakably real, unmistakably incriminating, and impossibly disturbing. The discovery shattered Jeffrey's calm mask instantly. When confronted, he muttered a few quiet words, something close to surrender, before attempting to resist. A brief struggle followed, but the officers quickly subdued him. In that moment, on a warm July night, under the dim lights of a cluttered apartment, Jeffrey Dahmer's years of silence, secrecy, and darkness finally came to an end. Word spread rapidly through the building, echoing through hallways and stairwells. Residents stepped out of their apartments, shocked, confused, some trembling with a realization that hit them with overwhelming force: their instincts had been right. The fear they had carried, the warnings they had spoken, the unease they had felt, none of it had been imagined. The police presence grew within minutes, officers entering and exiting the unit as they began uncovering the truth piece by piece. The building, once filled with the muffled noises of everyday life, now buzzed with radio chatter, footsteps, and the quiet but undeniable energy of revelation. People watched from windows and doorways, some crying, some shaking, some whispering prayers or curses. The Oxford Apartments had always felt like it held secrets, but no one had imagined the scale of what was finally coming into the light. And inside a police car parked in front of the building, Jeffrey Dahmer sat in handcuffs, staring ahead with a strange, hollow calm. He didn't plead. He didn't shout. He didn't deny. His voice was quiet, almost detached, when he finally said the words that would define the night. "For what I did, I should be dead." As Jeffrey Dahmer sat handcuffed in the back of the patrol car, the weight of what had happened began to settle over Milwaukee like a slow-moving fog. Officers moved in and out of the Oxford Apartments with cautious urgency, their faces shifting between shock, disbelief, and a grim sense of duty as the scope of the situation became impossible to ignore. Residents gathered in clusters outside, leaning against railings, sitting on stoops, whispering to one another as the magnitude of the moment unfolded. Some were quiet, staring blankly at the chaos around them, others paced with anxious energy, reliving every uneasy moment they had felt over the past months and years. A few cried softly, shaken by the realization that danger had lived just feet from their doors. And through it all, the building that had once carried a faint, lingering heaviness now felt alive with noise and movement, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had defined its hallways for so long. The long sleep had ended, the city was waking, and the truth was beginning to surface. Once at the station, Jeffrey's calm mask remained strangely intact, though it no longer served as protection. Instead, it seemed almost like resignation, as though he understood the gravity of what had happened and recognized that the world he had built, the secrecy, the routines, the apartment that had served as both refuge and prison, was collapsing in on itself. Detectives sat across from him, prepared for denial or resistance, but what they encountered instead was a quiet man who began speaking with unsettling openness. His tone was steady, almost emotionless, as he answered questions with a matter-of-fact clarity that startled even seasoned investigators. There were no dramatic outbursts, no evasions. He spoke plainly, as though the words had been waiting inside him for years, building pressure until they finally spilled out in an unbroken chain of confession. And with each answer, with each revelation, the detectives realized they were listening to one of the most disturbing and complex criminal histories in modern American law enforcement. What made the confession even more startling was the precision with which Jeffrey recalled events. He remembered dates, locations, details of encounters, the patterns of behavior he had followed, and the elaborate efforts he had taken to conceal his actions. He explained his motivations with a cold, clinical detachment that made the room feel unnaturally still, as though everyone present was witnessing something beyond typical criminal behavior. Detectives found themselves taking careful notes, exchanging glances, and asking follow-up questions that Jeffrey answered without hesitation. He did not attempt to shift blame or claim innocence. He did not portray himself as misunderstood or mistreated. Instead, he spoke as though describing events that belonged to someone else, his emotional distance creating a chilling contrast to the gravity of what he admitted. The more he spoke, the more the detectives realized just how many opportunities had been missed over the years, missed calls from neighbors, overlooked disappearances, warnings that never reached the right people, encounters with law enforcement that ended too quickly. It was a realization that carried a heavy weight, not only for investigators but for the community itself. The silence surrounding Jeffrey's life had not been accidental, it had been a product of systemic failures, miscommunications, and assumptions that allowed him to remain unnoticed for far too long. And now that the truth was exposed, the question of how this had happened lingered in every room, casting a shadow over each new detail Jeffrey shared. Outside the station, news of the arrest spread rapidly. Reporters arrived in waves, filming the building, interviewing residents, and attempting to piece together the story before official statements were released. Families of missing young men gathered around televisions, radios, and phone lines, waiting for confirmation or denial, their hearts caught between hope and dread. Some recognized the Oxford apartments immediately, remembering moments when their loved ones had last been seen near the neighborhood. Others held their breath, praying not to hear the names they feared most. For them, the arrest brought both relief and anguish, relief that someone had finally been caught, anguish that the truth they had long suspected might be far worse than they imagined. The pain of uncertainty, which had stretched over months and sometimes years, now condensed into an agonizing wait for answers. Back inside the interrogation room, Jeffrey continued to speak with a calmness that unsettled everyone present. He described his routines, the emotional void he lived with, the loneliness that consumed him, and the compulsions he could not control. Detectives noticed that he rarely expressed anger or sadness, instead, his voice carried a flat, almost hollow tone, as though the events he described no longer belonged to him. When asked why he was being so open, Jeffrey offered simple explanations. He was tired of hiding, tired of living with the pressure, tired of the cycle he couldn't escape. There was no grand moment of remorse or dramatic shift in emotion, only the steady release of information from a man who had spent years trapped in his own mind, unable or unwilling to seek help, unable to stop himself, and now unable to maintain the secrecy that had defined his life. As the hours passed, the detectives realized they had entered a rare psychological landscape, a glimpse into the mind of someone who lived with complex layers of compulsion, detachment, and self-loathing. They listened carefully, documenting everything with the knowledge that this confession would shape not only the future of the case but the way investigators understood similar patterns of behavior in years to come. The interrogation became both an investigation and a study, each detail offering insight into how Jeffrey navigated his double life and how so many warning signs had gone unrecognized. Every moment spent in that room added another piece to a story that would soon stun the world. When the first night ended and Jeffrey was led back to a holding cell, detectives stepped out of the interrogation room in a daze. The weight of what they had heard settled over them slowly, like dust drifting through quiet air. Some paced the hallways, replaying parts of the confession in their minds. Others sat down, staring at their notes, unable to fully absorb the scope of what had unfolded. The truth was overwhelming, not just the details of the crimes, but the realization that this had all taken place inside a quiet apartment in a city full of people who had unknowingly lived beside one of the most complex serial offenders in American history. It was a truth that reshaped their understanding of danger, proximity, and the fragile boundaries between ordinary life and unimaginable darkness. And outside, as dawn approached and Milwaukee began waking from its long sleep, the city braced itself for what came next: press conferences, investigations, grieving families, public fear, and the unraveling of secrets that had been buried behind the door of apartment 213. The silence had ended. The confessions had begun. And nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 14, The Trial, Justice and Shockwaves. In the months following Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest, Milwaukee found itself caught in a whirlwind of shock, confusion, anger, and disbelief, a city forced to confront truths that seemed too vast, too disturbing, and too close to home to fully comprehend. What had once been whispered suspicion among neighbors now erupted into national headlines, thrusting the Oxford apartments into the harsh spotlight of a world desperate for answers. The community, especially those living near North 25th Street, struggled with the sudden transformation of their neighborhood from a quiet, overlooked corner of the city into the epicenter of one of the most talked-about criminal cases in decades. Reporters gathered in relentless waves, residents found themselves interviewed repeatedly, and police worked tirelessly to assemble the overwhelming amount of evidence that had been recovered from apartment 213. And as the legal system prepared itself for the trial, the public grappled with emotions that shifted by the hour: grief for the victims, anger toward institutional failures, shock at the details emerging, and a collective sense of disbelief that someone so unassuming had carried out acts that defied imagination. Inside the courthouse, where days blended into nights beneath fluorescent lights and the quiet hum of legal machinery, prosecutors built a case designed to present not only the physical evidence but the pattern of behavior that had defined Jeffrey's life for years. They pored over documents, interviewed witnesses, consulted experts, and pieced together a timeline that traced his actions from early adulthood to the night of his arrest. The challenge was immense, not because the evidence was lacking, but because the scale of the case was nearly unprecedented. Detectives filled boxes with photographs, statements, personal belongings recovered from the apartment, and detailed notes from Jeffrey's confession. Forensic teams analyzed every item, reconstructing events with meticulous care. Psychologists prepared to testify about Jeffrey's mental state, offering insights into his behaviors, his compulsions, and the emotional detachment that shaped his life. Meanwhile, families of victims waited quietly, their grief stretching across the courthouse like an invisible weight. They sat in rows during pre-trial hearings, holding hands, clutching photographs, or staring straight ahead with the kind of stillness that comes from years of unanswered questions. Jeffrey himself remained calm throughout this early preparation, as if the arrest had shifted something inside him. He no longer hid behind routines or detachment. Instead, he cooperated almost completely, speaking to investigators with a quiet, steady tone that rarely changed. His attorneys faced a daunting task. The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions explicit, and the psychological complexity of the case left little room for traditional defense strategies. The question was not whether Jeffrey had committed the crimes, he had already admitted to them in extraordinary detail, but whether he was legally sane when he did. This distinction would become the central focus of the trial, creating a tense and complicated debate between psychiatric experts, prosecutors, and the defense. When the trial finally began in January 1992, the courthouse steps were lined with crowds, some seeking answers, others seeking closure, and some driven by curiosity that often accompanies notorious cases. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. Families of victims sat closely together, each carrying unimaginable weight. Reporters filled benches, notebooks open, pens ready to capture every moment. Law enforcement officers who had worked on the case lined the walls, their expressions tense, knowing the trial would force them to relive the details they had spent months collecting. And then there was Jeffrey, seated quietly beside his attorneys, dressed plainly, hands folded, eyes lowered. He did not attempt to meet the stares directed at him. He didn't look toward the families of victims or the prosecutors preparing to speak. Instead, he appeared absorbed in an inner stillness, almost as though he had stepped back from the world around him. The prosecution presented its case with methodical precision, outlining the timeline of disappearances and the growing pattern that had unfolded without detection. They introduced evidence recovered from apartment 213, each item carrying its own weight of meaning. They played recorded portions of Jeffrey's confession, letting the jury hear his calm, matter-of-fact acknowledgement of events. They called witnesses, neighbors, officers, family members, and experts, each adding another layer to the portrait they were constructing. Their argument was clear: Jeffrey Dahmer understood what he was doing, understood the consequences, and engaged in deliberate, intentional acts over a prolonged period of time. He was not out of control. He was calculating, aware, and responsible. The defense approached the case from a different perspective, focusing on the emotional and psychological landscape of Jeffrey's life. They called psychiatrists who spoke about his childhood, his isolation, his escalating compulsions, and the mental illnesses that shaped his internal world. They argued that Jeffrey suffered from disorders that impaired his ability to control his actions, that his emotional detachment and distorted thinking placed him outside the boundaries of legal sanity. They did not deny what he had done, they sought to explain why. Their case hinged on the belief that Jeffrey lived with profound psychological fractures that blurred the line between intention and compulsion. For some in the courtroom, these explanations offered a window into understanding his behavior. For others, they felt like an attempt to soften the impact of unspeakable harm. Throughout the trial, Jeffrey maintained a posture of quiet resignation. When he spoke, his voice remained steady, unhurried. He did not lash out or attempt to defend himself. He acknowledged the hurt he caused, at times expressing a subdued remorse that appeared genuine but muted, as though the emotions behind it were too tangled to articulate. He admitted to planning, to struggling with urges he could not control, to feeling trapped in a cycle he did not know how to escape. But he also admitted that he knew what he was doing was wrong. This acknowledgement became a turning point, one that the prosecution highlighted repeatedly to counter the defense's claims. As the weeks passed, the courtroom became a place where the community's pain was laid bare. Family members of victims testified, their voices shaking, their memories vivid. They spoke of sons, brothers, friends, of dreams interrupted, futures erased, and years spent searching without answers. Their testimony grounded the trial in reality, reminding everyone present that behind every piece of evidence and every expert analysis stood real people whose lives had been forever altered. These moments filled the room with a heaviness that lingered long after each witness stepped down. When both sides rested their cases, the jury retreated to deliberate, a process that weighed not only evidence but the complex psychological portrait that had emerged. And outside, the city held its breath. Milwaukee had waited years for answers, now it waited for justice. As the jury entered deliberation, an uneasy quiet settled over the courthouse, a stillness that felt deeper, heavier, and more fragile than anything that had come before. Families huddled in corners of the hallway, some holding hands, others sitting silently with their thoughts. Detectives who had worked countless hours on the case waited with attention that pressed into their shoulders. Attorneys paced slowly or sat with their heads bowed, reviewing notes they knew would no longer matter. Even reporters lowered their voices, aware that the outcome of this trial would echo far beyond Milwaukee. It was a pause suspended in time, a moment in which every person who had been touched by the case, directly or indirectly, felt the gravity of what was about to be decided. And in a small, windowless jury room, 12 individuals sifted through the evidence, the testimony, the emotions, and the arguments that had shaped the weeks-long trial. They carried with them the responsibility of determining not only the legal fate of Jeffrey Dahmer, but a verdict that would send ripples through the country, influencing conversations about justice, mental illness, policing, and community trust for years to come. The deliberation, though intense, did not stretch on for days. The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions clear, the testimonies cohesive. What took the longest was not determining whether Jeffrey had committed the crimes, he had already admitted to them, it was weighing the complex psychological arguments presented by the defense. The jury examined expert statements, debated the nuances of legal sanity, and reflected on the detailed accounts of Jeffrey's behavior over the years. They considered his calmness, his planning, his awareness of consequences, and his attempts to conceal evidence. And ultimately, they reached a unanimous conclusion: Jeffrey Dahmer had known what he was doing. He was legally responsible for his actions. When the jury re-entered the courtroom, the air tightened. People rose to their feet, hearts pounding, breaths held. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreperson stood, holding the paper that would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The verdict was read slowly, clearly, each word striking the room with the force of finality: guilty on all counts. Jeffrey Dahmer was found legally sane and fully accountable. A wave of emotion rippled across the courtroom, silent tears from family members, quiet nods from officers who had carried the weight of the case, and a soft exhale from prosecutors who had prepared meticulously for this moment. Jeffrey listened to the verdict with the same subdued demeanor he had maintained throughout the trial. He did not flinch, did not show surprise, did not break down. Instead, he sat motionless, hands folded neatly in front of him, absorbing the words as though he had expected them all along. His attorneys placed gentle hands on his arm, speaking softly, but his gaze remained distant, unfocused. For the families of the victims, the verdict brought a complex, layered blend of emotions: relief that justice had been served, sorrow for what had been lost, and a quiet dignity in knowing that their loved ones had been acknowledged, their voices finally heard. Some cried openly, others held their grief inside, but all felt the weight of closure settling slowly over their hearts. It was not a closure that erased pain or answered every question, but it was a step toward healing, a recognition that the long, harrowing search for truth had finally ended. The sentencing phase followed shortly after, during which Jeffrey was given multiple consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his existence within the walls of a maximum security prison. The judge spoke firmly, acknowledging the unimaginable harm done to the victims and the community. He addressed the failures of institutions, the overlooked warnings, the pain endured by families who had searched for their missing sons. He condemned Jeffrey's actions as deliberate, horrific, and inexcusable. And when the final sentence was pronounced, the courtroom fell into a deep, heavy silence. It was a silence that carried both grief and resolution, a silence that marked the transition from public trial to private mourning for many of the families who had stood strong for years. In the days that followed, Milwaukee tried to piece itself back together. The Oxford apartments were quickly vacated, the building stripped of its tenants and condemned. For many residents, leaving felt like shedding the weight of a nightmare, though the emotional scars lingered. Journalists continued broadcasting updates, documentaries began forming, and experts appeared on talk shows to analyze the psychological and social aspects of the case. The nation was captivated not by sensationalism alone, but by the deeper questions the case raised: how had this happened unseen for so long? How could someone so quiet, so ordinary in appearance, commit acts so far removed from the image he projected? How could warning signs be missed repeatedly? And what could communities learn from this tragedy to protect vulnerable individuals moving forward? Inside prison, Jeffrey entered yet another phase of his life, one defined by routine, structure, and constant observation. He was evaluated by psychiatric professionals, monitored by correctional staff, and placed under protective conditions due to the nature of his crimes. Yet even in prison, the contradictions of his personality persisted. He was polite, cooperative, and soft-spoken, the same traits that had once allowed him to blend into society without suspicion. He spent time reading, participating in work assignments, and speaking to chaplains who saw in him a man burdened by guilt but emotionally detached from his own remorse. He did not fight his circumstances. He did not seek appeal. Instead, he settled into a quiet acceptance, acknowledging that the court's decision had been just. For the families, healing was a longer, more winding journey. Some found comfort in faith, others in community, others in years of therapy and reflection. Memorials were created, vigils held, support groups formed. And as time passed, the narrative surrounding the case shifted, from the horror of the crimes to the resilience of the families, the failures that require correction, and the psychological lessons that experts would draw upon in future cases. The trial had not only brought justice, it had illuminated gaps in institutional response, in community trust, and in the ability of society to recognize danger hidden beneath normalcy. It was a painful lesson, but one that reshaped law enforcement practices, forensic psychology, and the way missing person cases were handled across the country. As the years passed, the shockwaves of the trial slowly transformed into a quieter legacy, a legacy of remembrance, of vigilance, of systemic change. Milwaukee would never forget the summer of 1991, the trial of 1992, or the lessons carved from the grief of families who had lost so much. And though the chapter of legal justice had closed, the story of Jeffrey Dahmer continued to echo, reminding the world that danger does not always announce itself loudly, that evil can hide behind gentle manners, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still find its way through even the darkest silence. Chapter 15, Reflections on Evil, Lessons and the Human Psyche. What remained after the trial, after the sentencing, after the headlines faded and the television crews packed their equipment, was something quieter, heavier, and far more complicated, a space where an entire city, an entire nation, and the families of the victims tried to make sense of what had happened, to understand how a man like Jeffrey Dahmer had existed in the shadows of ordinary life for so long, unnoticed, unchallenged, and unimagined. In the weeks following the verdict, Milwaukee found itself trapped between grief and introspection, as if the city itself were trying to search for signs it had missed, for clues that could explain how the horror had evolved so silently. Psychologists, criminologists, and journalists began examining Dahmer's life as if peeling back layers of a vast, unsettling puzzle, trying to separate the myths from the man, the pathology from the choices, the trauma from the intent. They studied his early childhood loneliness, his fascination with death, his struggles with identity, and the quiet emotional void that followed him into adulthood. But even as experts dissected the pieces of his personality, a lingering truth hovered above everything: no single explanation could fully define him. He was not simply the product of a troubled upbringing, nor solely the result of psychological imbalance. He was a convergence, a rare, disturbing combination of traits that formed a darkness few could comprehend. And that complexity forced people to ask deeper questions about the human psyche, questions that echoed through academic circles, newsrooms, and neighborhood conversations alike. Communities across the country began discussing the nature of evil in ways they hadn't before, recognizing that it didn't always appear as a snarling monster or a stranger lurking in shadows. Sometimes, evil looked like a man who held the door open for neighbors, who smiled politely at checkout counters, who chatted calmly with coworkers during lunch breaks. The case forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality: danger can hide behind normalcy, cruelty can exist behind quiet eyes, and someone capable of unspeakable acts can share the same sidewalks, the same buses, the same grocery stores as everyone else. For many, this realization was not paranoia, it was an awakening, a reminder that intuition, awareness, and community vigilance mattered more than ever. And yet, in that reflection, there also came a sense of responsibility, a desire to understand mental illness more deeply, addiction more compassionately, trauma more seriously, and isolation more urgently. Because while Dahmer's actions were his own, the gaps that allowed him to operate, social, medical, and institutional, were part of a larger story, one that communities hoped to learn from rather than repeat. Families of the victims were central to these conversations. Their voices, once overshadowed by shock and confusion, grew stronger as they shared their memories, their grief, and their determination to prevent future tragedies. Some spoke publicly about the need for better missing person procedures, emphasizing how many of their sons had been dismissed as runaways or troublemakers rather than individuals whose disappearances warranted immediate concern. Others advocated for greater sensitivity toward marginalized communities, Black families, immigrant families, and LGBTQ families who felt that their fears had not been taken seriously by authorities. Their testimonies highlighted a painful but undeniable truth: societal bias had played a role in how slowly the case unfolded. And as these stories reached national audiences, they sparked discussions about prejudice, discrimination, and the ways in which law enforcement must evolve to protect every community with equal urgency, equal compassion, and equal respect. Experts in forensic psychology studied Dahmer's interviews extensively, analyzing his calm recounting of events, his unusual self-awareness, and his ability to articulate the contradictions within himself. They noted his lack of outward rage, his detachment from moral judgment, and his complex relationship with control and abandonment. Some professionals pointed to narcissistic traits, others to antisocial tendencies, and still others to deep emotional deficiencies that shaped his worldview. But across all perspectives, one theme remained consistent: Dahmer existed at a crossroads between comprehension and incomprehensibility, a person whose inner workings could be studied but never fully mapped. And this, in itself, became a lesson for the psychological field, that not all motivations can be neatly categorized, not all behaviors can be predicted, and not all crimes can be explained by simple cause and effect. Instead, his case reminded the world that the human mind, under certain conditions, can foster distortions of morality so profound that they challenge the boundaries of understanding. Meanwhile, in Milwaukee, people tried to rebuild their sense of safety. Streets that once felt familiar now carried memories of fear. Apartment buildings that had seemed ordinary now held echoes of tragedy. And yet, slowly, the city began to heal, not by forgetting, but by facing the past head-on. New support groups emerged, connecting families affected by violent crime. Schools and churches offered counseling. Community programs worked to build stronger relationships between residents and local law enforcement. And as the years passed, the memory of the case evolved. It was no longer only a story of one man's actions, it became a symbol of the importance of listening closely, of noticing subtle signs, of valuing every life, and of acknowledging every disappearance as worthy of urgent attention. In academic settings, criminology courses used the Dahmer case as a study in the complexities of deviant behavior, the challenges of prevention, and the impact of early intervention. Forensic science advanced its techniques in part because of lessons learned from the investigations. DNA analysis grew more sophisticated, interagency communication improved, and protocols around missing person cases expanded to include immediate risk factors rather than assumptions. Even popular culture, though occasionally sensationalizing the case, played a role in keeping conversations alive, encouraging society to confront, rather than ignore, the uncomfortable realities of predatory behavior and systemic blind spots. As for Jeffrey Dahmer himself, his final years in prison represented a strange contradiction. He maintained the same quiet, polite manner he had shown during his trial, rarely causing trouble, rarely raising his voice. Some inmates viewed him with hostility, others with a kind of eerie fascination. Chaplains visited him, counselors tried to understand him, and prison staff maintained strict oversight. Dahmer sometimes expressed remorse, though his words often carried an emotional flatness that left listeners uncertain about their sincerity. His reflections during interviews revealed a man who believed he deserved his sentence, who acknowledged that his urges were abnormal, and who seemed to recognize that something inside him had always been profoundly broken. But whether these acknowledgments